Isabella Rivera stared at the fridge notice. Rent due. Lights overdue. Everything on the line. But instead of giving up, she picked up a notebook. A budget. Envelopes. And a dream. Beans. Rice. Side hustles. A jar called Last Debt. Every dollar a weapon. Years later, that jar set them free. Watch the full story, how one family paid $20,000 in debt while living in a tiny apartment. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. A low, steady vibration, filling the silence like a reminder of everything that was both dependable and fragile in Isabella Rivera's life. The space was small, 500 square feet of compromise. The kitchen bled into the living room into the hallway, and the hallway into the single bedroom where her daughter slept. Every wall carried the faint echo of the city beyond, muffled but never silent. Car horns in the distance. A neighbor's footsteps upstairs. The drip of a leaky faucet that Daniel had promised to fix months ago. But tonight, none of that mattered. Isabella stood before the refrigerator, her shoulders slumped, her eyes locked on a single piece of paper pinned with a crooked magnet. The word glared back at her in red, bold, unforgiving letters. Final notice. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out and touched it. The paper was thin, almost delicate, but it carried the weight of every mistake, every delayed payment, every desperate, we'll figure it out next month conversation. It was the kind of paper that could unravel a life. She didn't cry. Not yet. Isabella had learned long ago that tears didn't pay bills. Tears didn't erase interest charges or late fees. They didn't stretch a dollar. But her chest was tight, her breath shallow, and the air around her fell heavy, as though the apartment itself was watching her and waiting for her next move. Behind her, Daniel's voice came softly from the couch. Isabella. He didn't need to ask what she was looking at. He already knew. She turned her head slowly. Daniel Rivera was 34, his dark hair still damp from the shower he'd taken after his late shift. He wore the same gray t-shirt he always did on nights like this, the fabric worn thin at the collar. His eyes, tired but gentle, met hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched long enough that Isabella felt Elena stir in the bedroom, a small cough muffled by blankets. Their daughter had fallen asleep earlier while coloring on the floor, crayons still scattered near her bed. Isabella's throat tightened. She thought about Elena's small hands clutching her favorite stuffed bear, about the way she always whispered good night twice, for luck. The thought of that little girl growing up in fear of eviction notices and overdue bills was unbearable. We can't keep doing this, Isabella whispered finally. Daniel exhaled, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He rubbed his temples, his posture heavy with the exhaustion of a man carrying more than his share of invisible weight. I know, he said. His voice cracked slightly, betraying a mixture of guilt and defeat. I know. The debt wasn't new. It had been creeping up on them for years. A credit card opened when Isabella lost her part-time job in groceries went on plastic. A medical bill from when Elena had a fever that turned into an ER visit. A payday loan that Daniel swore they'd pay back in weeks, but weeks became months, and months became years. Now, it was $20,000. A mountain of numbers, interest rates, and sleepless nights. And tonight, it felt like the mountain was about to collapse on top of them. Isabella pressed her palm flat against the fridge, grounding herself. The cool metal under her hand was strangely comforting. She remembered her mother's voice, years ago, when Isabella had been a teenager sitting at their own cluttered kitchen table. Her mother had said, Mija, money doesn't disappear. It tells you where it went. You just have to listen. At 16, she had rolled her eyes. At 32, those words returned like an uninvited echo. Maybe her mother had been right. Maybe the problem wasn't just money. It was not listening to it, not tracking it, not owning it. We need a plan, Isabella said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her tone. Daniel looked up, eyebrows raised. A plan. Yes. She pulled the notice off the fridge and held it up between them like evidence in a trial. We can't keep waiting for next month, or the month after that. We need to sit down, figure out exactly what we owe, and attack it. Daniel hesitated. She could see the doubt in his eyes. They had tried before, half-hearted budgets scribbled on the backs of envelopes, promises to spend less, to save more. But always, something came up. A car repair, school supplies, a birthday gift. What if we can't? he asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Heavy. Dangerous. Isabella stepped closer, her voice steadier now. Then we figure it out. Together. But we can't keep living like this, Daniel. I won't let Elena grow up thinking this is normal. For the first time in weeks, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not defeat, but resolve. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Let's do it. That night, after Elena was tucked in and the apartment was quiet, Isabella spread their bills across the kitchen table. Receipts, statements, crumpled envelopes, all lined up like soldiers in a losing battle. She pulled out a notebook, the same one she had once used to track Elena's feeding schedule as a baby, and drew 2 columns. Income and expenses. Her pen hovered above the paper. For a moment, she felt paralyzed. Writing it down would make it real. But then she thought of her mother's words again. Listen to where the money goes. She started with Daniel's paycheck, $2,300 a month. Her own part-time income from freelancing, $600. Total, $2,900. Then the expenses, $850 rent, $120 utilities, $50 internet, $400 groceries, $250 car payment, $300 minimum debt payments. The list went on. By the time she was done, her hand ached, and her heart sank. Their income barely covered their outgo. Some months it didn't. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, frowning at the numbers. It doesn't add up. No, Isabella said. It doesn't. But at least now we know. She underlined the words at the top of the page, budget. The word felt foreign, like a guest in their home. But it was also a lifeline. That night, long after Daniel had gone to bed, Isabella sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open and the fridge humming beside her. She circled one phrase on the page, debt snowball. She had read about it earlier that week in a blog post while scrolling on her phone during her lunch break. Pay off the smallest debt first, then roll that payment into the next. Momentum builds. Small wins turn into big ones. It sounded almost too simple. But maybe simple was what they needed. For the first time in a long time, Isabella felt something stirring inside her. Not panic, not despair, but the faintest spark of hope. She closed the notebook, turned off the kitchen light, and whispered to herself in the dark apartment, "We're going to do this. Dollar by dollar. We're going to do this." And with that, she allowed herself to believe, just a little, that their story could change. The morning sun crept slowly through the blinds, cutting thin lines of gold across the small apartment. Isabella Rivera stirred awake to the sound of Elena's soft footsteps padding across the floor. The 6-year-old carried her blanket like a cape, hair wild from sleep, eyes still heavy but curious. "Mommy," Elena whispered, climbing onto the edge of the bed. "Is it breakfast time?" Isabella rubbed her eyes and smiled faintly. Even in their most difficult days, Elena had a way of softening the edges of reality. "In a minute, Carino," she said, pulling her daughter close. The apartment was quiet except for the muffled city outside and Daniel's light snore from the couch. He had fallen asleep there after staying up late, reading job postings on his phone. The cushions sagged under his weight, the faint smell of detergent mixing with the lingering scent of last night's reheated beans. Isabella sat up slowly, glancing around the single-bedroom apartment they called home. It was not ugly. It was not even broken. But it was small, impossibly small for 3 people. The living room doubled as Daniel's sleeping space when he came home late and didn't want to wake Isabella. The kitchen, barely larger than a closet, had one counter that doubled as a prep station, dining table, and homework desk for Elena. Their bedroom, the only one, was barely wide enough to fit a queen-size mattress pushed against the wall and a small dresser that groaned under the weight of folded clothes. Every corner carried evidence of compromise. The hallway closet was not for coats, but for boxes labeled winter clothes and baby things. The bathroom had no storage, so shampoo bottles lined the edge of the tub. A single shelf above the toilet sagged with towels folded tighter than origami to make space. And yet, within this 500-square-foot world, they lived. Isabella shuffled into the kitchen, Elena at her heels. She reached into the cabinet and pulled out a box of oats, the one item she knew would stretch across breakfast for the week. Oatmeal had become a ritual, filling, cheap, and versatile enough that Elena could be convinced it was special, with a sprinkle of cinnamon or a drizzle of honey. As the water boiled, Isabella's eyes caught the edges of the fridge again. The final notice was gone, tucked away in her notebook, but the magnet that had held it still remained. Now it pinned up one of Elena's drawings. 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a small house with a red roof. The drawing ached in her chest. Elena's version of home was bigger, brighter, more secure. A place with space. A place without walls that pressed in. "Mommy, can I have extra honey?" Elena asked, pulling Isabella out her thoughts. "Just a little," Isabella said, spooning oats into bowls. Daniel stirred awake at the smell, yawning as he walked into the kitchen. He kissed Isabella's temple, ruffling Elena's hair before grabbing a chipped mug from the cabinet. Coffee brewed in a machine that hissed and sputtered like it was protesting the job. "Morning," he muttered. "Morning," Isabella replied softly. They sat at the counter together, knees brushing under the narrow space. Elena hummed as she ate, swinging her legs in rhythm. Daniel scrolled through his phone, half-focused. Isabella chewed slowly, her eyes fixed on the notebook she had left on the counter last night. The word budget stared back at her from the cover. Later that day, after dropping Elena at school, Isabella walked home alone. The building's stairwell smelled faintly of bleach and fried onions from the neighbor's dinner the night before. The paint peeled near the baseboards, and the air was always slightly damp. She unlocked the door and stepped into their apartment. It felt different in the daylight, smaller somehow, every corner illuminated. She walked slowly through the space, really looking at it for the first time in a long time. The couch with its worn cushions. The bookshelf overflowing with paperbacks and unopened mail. The single window that overlooked a parking lot instead of a garden. It wasn't just small. It was cramped with the weight of everything they had tried to hold on to. A wedding vase from her aunt. Baby clothes too small for Elena, but too sentimental to discard. Kitchen gadgets they never used, but had received as gifts. Every object carried a story, a reason, an excuse. But together, they crowded the walls until the apartment felt less like a home and more like a storage unit they happened to live in. Isabella sat on the edge of the couch and exhaled deeply. This was the life they had chosen, or rather, the life they had defaulted into when debt dictated their options. The apartment was cheap by city standards. It was survival, nothing more. And yet, as she traced her fingers along the seam of a couch cushion, Isabella realized something. This small space was both prison and opportunity. If they could survive here, if they could learn to live not just with less space, but with less consumption, maybe they could carve a way out. That evening, when Daniel returned from work, Isabella spoke quietly but firmly. "We need to talk about this place," she said. He frowned, toeing off his shoes. "What about it?" She gestured around. "It's too small. But maybe that's what will save us." Daniel sat down slowly, confusion on his face. "I don't follow." "If we embrace it," Isabella explained, "if we stop fighting against the smallness and start using it as a tool, it could force us to spend less, to live simpler. No room for clutter, no room for extras. Just what we need." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "So what? We pretend we like it." "Not pretend," Isabella said. "Choose it. Make it work for us." He was quiet for a long time, then nodded. Minimalism. The word lingered between them. Neither had ever considered it seriously, but in that moment, it didn't sound like a lifestyle trend or a Pinterest board. It sounded like survival. Over the next few weeks, the Riveras began to see their apartment differently. The clutter became a mirror. Each drawer they opened, each shelf they sorted, revealed how much money they had wasted over the years. Kitchen gadgets purchased in moments of hope, but never used. Clothes bought on sale, but worn only once. Toys Elena had outgrown within months. Each donation box they filled felt like an exorcism. Each trip to the thrift store or online listing brought a few extra dollars, small but tangible. Isabella created a rule, one in, one out. If something new came in, something old had to leave. Soon, the apartment began to breathe again. The walls felt wider. The air felt lighter. But more than that, their mindset began to shift. On a rainy Saturday, Isabella sat cross-legged on the living room floor with Elena, folding laundry into neat stacks. Daniel brewed coffee in the kitchen, humming quietly. The rain tapped on the window, steady and soothing. For the first time in years, Isabella felt peace in their small apartment. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was a beginning. She looked around at the cleared shelves, the tidy counter, the notebook on the table now filled with numbers and crossed-out debts. This place, she thought, isn't just small. It's teaching us how to live. And with that realization, the tiny apartment stopped being their punishment. It became their training ground. The evenings settled over the apartment like a heavy blanket. The city outside hummed with life, cars rushing past, voices echoing down the street. But inside, the Rivera's home was quiet, save for the faint scratching of Isabella's pen against paper. She sat at the kitchen counter, the same place where she had stared at the final notice weeks ago. Tonight, the notice was gone, replaced with a spread of bills, receipts, and a notebook that had become her lifeline. The pages were no longer empty. They were filled with columns of numbers, smudged ink from long hours of writing, and tiny notes in the margins. Double-check grocery cost. Ask Daniel about gas money. Elena's school supplies due next month. The notebook was more than paper. It was a mirror. It reflected every choice they had made, every dollar they had earned, every cent they had let slip through their fingers. Daniel sat across from her, elbows on the table, brow furrowed as he stared at a receipt for car repairs from 3 months ago. Elena lay on the rug nearby, her crayon spread out around her, drawing pictures of flowers and sunshine, images that felt almost foreign in the tension of the room. Isabella tapped the pen against the page. "Okay," she said softly, steadying her voice. "Let's do this." Daniel glanced up, weary but attentive. "We bring in about $2,900 a month," Isabella continued, repeating the number she had calculated the week before. "Rent is $850. Utilities and internet, about $170. Groceries," she hesitated, flipping back through receipts, usually around $450. "Car payment, $250. Gas and insurance, another $220. Minimum debt payments, about $300. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "And that doesn't even cover surprises. Like the doctor's bill." "I know." Isabella circled the debt payment line with her pen. "That's why we need a system. No more guessing. No more, we'll see what's left at the end of the month. Every dollar needs a job." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Every dollar?" "Yes," Isabella said firmly. "Every single one." She had been reading about it for days. The idea of zero-based budgeting. At first, it sounded impossible, even suffocating. But the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the only way forward. If they didn't tell their money where to go, it would keep slipping through their fingers, disappearing into takeout meals, impulse buys, and the silent leak of interest charges. She slid a stack of envelopes across the table. They were plain, the kind she had found in the back of a drawer, some already creased and yellowed with age. In black marker, she had written bold labels across the front: groceries, gas, rent, debt, savings. Daniel stared at them, then at her. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious," Isabella said. She opened the groceries envelope and slipped in $100 in cash, the first portion of what they had set aside for the week. "From now on, this is what we use. No cards, no guessing. If the envelope is empty, we stop spending." Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. "What about emergencies?" "That's why we're building savings too," Isabella said, pointing to another envelope. "Even if it's only $10 this month, it goes in there. No exceptions." For a moment, silence settled between them. Isabella could hear Elena humming softly, the scrape of a crayon against paper. She could hear the hum of the fridge, the creak of the building settling. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Daniel finally nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's try it." The first week was brutal. At the grocery store, Isabella pushed a cart with careful precision, calculator in one hand, list in the other. Elena sat in the seat, swinging her legs, asking for snacks, while Isabella explained gently, "Not this week, Carino. We have to stick to the list." She swapped brand-name cereal for generic. She bypassed prepackaged snacks in favor of bulk rice and beans. She compared unit prices like a scientist, muttering numbers under her breath. By the time they reached the register, the total was $47.89. Isabella exhaled in relief as she pulled 2 20s and a 10 from the groceries envelope. The cashier glanced at the envelope curiously, but Isabella didn't care. For the first time, she felt in control. At home, Daniel joked half-heartedly when Isabella refused to order pizza on Friday night. "I guess envelopes don't allow for cravings." "No, Isabella said with a small smile. But they allow for freedom. Still, the adjustment wasn't easy. Daniel grumbled when he had to pack lunch instead of grabbing something from the diner near work. Isabella fought temptation when she walked past the clearance rack at the store. Elena pouted when she wanted ice cream, and Isabella had to say no. But every time they resisted, every time they made a deliberate choice, Isabella felt the faintest shift inside her, like a muscle growing stronger with each repetition. By the end of the month, something remarkable had happened. They had stuck to their budget. Not perfectly, not without slip-ups, but close enough to make a difference. They had paid all their bills on time. They had even managed to put $50 into the savings envelope. And for the first time in years, they hadn't added to their debt. Isabella sat at the table, notebook open, calculator beside her. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, eyes scanning the numbers. Elena slept in the bedroom, her tiny snores muffled by blankets. "Look at this," Isabella whispered, pointing to the page. "We did it. We didn't go over." Daniel let out a low whistle. "And we didn't use the credit card." "No," Isabella said, a smile tugging at her lips. "We didn't." They weren't debt-free. They weren't even close. But they had taken the first step, the hardest step. They had faced their numbers, stared down their habits, and decided to take control. Isabella closed the notebook gently, resting her hand on the cover. Counting pennies, she thought. That's what it feels like. But maybe pennies are where the change begins. She looked at Daniel, his tired face softened by a glimmer of pride. She thought of Elena, asleep in the next room, dreaming her child's dreams. And she thought of herself, not the woman crushed by a final notice, but the woman who had stood up and said, "We need a plan." For the first time, Isabella believed they might actually make it. Dollar by dollar, envelope by envelope. They were beginning. Saturday morning sunlight spilled through the blinds, illuminating the small kitchen in golden stripes. Isabella Rivera tied her curls back into a loose bun, tugged on her oldest sweater, and stood at the counter with a look of fierce determination. On the counter lay a lined piece of paper, covered with scribbles and crossouts. Meal plan, week 1. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching her with half curiosity, half skepticism. "So, this is your new project." "Not a project," Isabella said, her pen tapping the paper. "A strategy." He smirked. "You make it sound like we're going into battle." She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing but playful. "We are." It had started earlier that week. Isabella had scrolled through a budgeting blog late at night, searching for ideas. The writer had talked about how meal prepping cut their grocery bill in half, how a freezer full of pre-made meals was like money in the bank. The phrase stuck with her. Money in the bank. Isabella had never thought about food that way. Groceries had always felt like a constant leak. No matter how much they spent, it never seemed to last. Bags of lettuce wilted before they could use them. Bread went moldy. Chicken sat too long in the fridge and spoiled before she cooked it. Wasted food. Wasted money. But what if, she thought, food could be planned like bills? What if every carrot, every grain of rice, every ounce of chicken had a purpose before it even hit the pan? She set her jaw, gripping the pen tighter. This wasn't just about food. It was about control. The grocery trip that morning was different. Isabella walked the aisles with military precision, list in hand, calculator at the ready. Elena pushed the cart, humming as she tossed in apples with exaggerated seriousness. Daniel followed behind, skeptical but amused, occasionally reaching for something only for Isabella to swat his hand away. "Not on the list," she said firmly when he grabbed a bag of chips. "But they're on sale," he argued, holding them up like evidence. "Not on the list," she repeated, and he sighed, placing them back with exaggerated defeat. The total at checkout, $62.37, less than half of what they usually spend in a week. Back at home, Isabella lined the groceries on the counter. Bags of rice and beans, frozen vegetables, a whole chicken, a dozen eggs, bulk oats, flour, potatoes, carrots, onions, garlic. Basic, humble ingredients, but plenty. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And now," Isabella said, rolling up her sleeves, "we cook." The first hour was chaos. Pots boiled, pans sizzled, knives clattered against cutting boards. Isabella chopped carrots while Daniel rinsed beans, the counters already covered in half-prepared dishes. Elena stood on a chair, proudly cracking eggs into a bowl and squealing when one broke messily in her hands. But slowly, a rhythm emerged. The chicken roasted in the oven, filling the apartment with a rich, savory aroma. Rice simmered on the stove in 2 large pots, one seasoned with garlic, another plain for versatility. Beans bubbled gently, releasing a hearty smell that reminded Isabella of her mother's kitchen. Tupperware containers lined the counter, waiting like empty vessels ready to be filled. By mid-afternoon, the chaos transformed into order. The counters were stacked with neatly packed meals: roasted chicken and rice, beans and tortillas, carrot and potato soup, egg muffins for breakfasts, even a simple batch of homemade bread cooling on the rack. Daniel whistled low, opening the fridge to see the shelves stacked like a well-organized puzzle. "I've never seen it this full." Isabella wiped sweat from her brow, her arms sore but her heart light. "It's not just full," she said. "It's planned." The impact was immediate. On Monday morning, instead of scrambling to figure out lunch, Daniel grabbed a container of beans and rice from the fridge. "This is actually pretty good," he admitted, surprised. On Tuesday night, when Isabella came home exhausted, dinner was already waiting in the fridge, ready to be heated. No temptation to order takeout. No argument about what to eat. By Friday, the fridge was still stocked, the meal stretching further than Isabella thought possible. And when she counted the cash in the groceries envelope, she realized they had nearly $40 left over. $40. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Proof that meal prepping worked. Proof that they could create stability out of chaos. That night, Isabella sat at the table with her notebook, Daniel beside her. She flipped to a new page and wrote in bold letters at the top, "Meal prep equals savings." "This," she said, circling the words, "is how we get ahead." But it wasn't just about the money. Something shifted in the Rivera household that week. Meals became rituals. Elena took pride in helping portion out rice, declaring herself the official scooper. Daniel started experimenting with spices, adding cumin to beans or cinnamon to oatmeal. Isabella found joy in baking bread, the smell filling the apartment like comfort itself. Their tiny kitchen, once a place of stress and scarcity, became a workshop of abundance. Every container in the fridge was a small victory. Every dollar saved was a brick in the foundation of their future. One Saturday night, as they sat around the table eating roasted chicken leftovers turned into soup, Daniel leaned back and smiled. "You know," he said, "this isn't so bad. Feels stable." Isabella met his eyes, her chest swelling with quiet pride. "Stable," she repeated softly. The word tasted better than the food. Of course, not every week went smoothly. One weekend, Isabella burned half the chicken, filling the apartment with smoke. Another time, she underestimated how quickly Elena would eat through the homemade muffins, leaving them without breakfast by Wednesday. Some meals grew monotonous. Beans, rice, beans again, and Daniel groaned dramatically, begging for variety. But even with mistakes, the system worked. Their grocery spending dropped by nearly $200 a month. Their reliance on takeout evaporated. Leftovers became creative reinventions instead of forgotten scraps. And slowly, the savings began to show. More money went into the debt envelope. More went into savings. Meal prepping wasn't just feeding them. It was freeing them. One Sunday evening, Isabella sat at the table, notebook open, watching Daniel and Elena portion soup into containers. Elena wore her scooper badge, a paper circle she had drawn herself, pinned proudly to her shirt. Daniel carefully labeled containers with a black marker. Isabella smiled, scribbling in her notebook. "Food is no longer a leak. It's a ladder." She paused, staring at the words. A ladder. Yes, that's what it felt like. Every meal prepped was a rung higher, pulling them out of the pit of debt. She closed the notebook gently, looking at her family. For the first time, she could see it clearly, a future not defined by debt notices and overdue bills, but by choices, by intentional living, by freedom, all from beans and rice, all from a chicken and some carrots, all from planning ahead. The meal prep revelation had changed everything. Friday night arrived like an exhale. Daniel dropped his keys into the chipped bowl by the door, the clink echoing in the small apartment. His shoulders sagged with the familiar weight of the workweek, his boots leaving faint marks on the worn linoleum. Isabella looked up from the kitchen table where she sat with Elena, crayons scattered between them, and caught the exhaustion in his eyes. But there was something different about tonight. No takeout menus taped to the fridge. No half-joking suggestion of pizza or burgers to kick off the weekend. Instead, the entertainment envelope sat in plain sight on the counter, thin as paper, containing only $10. Isabella had tucked it there on purpose, a reminder of the new rule they had agreed upon. "This weekend," she said softly as Daniel sank into the couch, "we don't spend a dime." He raised an eyebrow. "Not one. Not one," she replied, her voice steady. Daniel let out a low whistle, but he didn't argue. He reached down, lifted Elena onto his lap, and ruffled her hair as she giggled. "Guess it's just us and the crayons. Huh, kiddo?" Elena clapped her hands. "Can we make a fort?" And just like that, the weekend began. The first night was simple. Isabella pulled old sheets and blankets from the closet while Daniel dragged the couch cushions into the center of the living room. Elena bounced with excitement, directing the construction like a tiny foreman. "Higher, Daddy." "No, over there, Mommy." When the fort was finished, it looked like a lopsided castle, its towers leaning, its walls sagging in the middle. But to Elena, it was perfect. They crawled inside together, flashlights in hand, and Isabella pulled out a worn copy of Charlotte's Web from the shelf. Her voice filled the small, fabric-covered space, steady and warm as she read aloud. Elena curled against her side, eyes wide, while Daniel listened quietly, the beam of the flashlight catching the lines of his tired face. For a while, the outside world faded. No bills, no debt, no numbers hanging over their heads. Just the three of them in their makeshift castle, wrapped in the safety of story and laughter. When Isabella closed the book for the night, Elena whispered, "Can we do this again tomorrow?" Isabella kissed her forehead. "Yes, Carino. Tomorrow and the next day, too." Saturday morning began with the smell of fresh bread. Isabella had baked 2 loaves the night before, the crust golden and crisp. Daniel brewed coffee, the machine hissing and sputtering, while Elena danced barefoot across the kitchen tiles, her blanket cape trailing behind her. Breakfast was simple: slices of warm bread with butter, oatmeal topped with cinnamon, and mugs of steaming coffee. But there was something special in the simplicity. Each bite felt intentional, like they were savoring not just the food, but the choice to make do with what they had. After breakfast, Isabella pulled out her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "No spend weekend ideas." Daniel peered over her shoulder. "So, what's on the agenda, boss?" She smiled, tapping her pen against the paper. "We have a park. We have board games. We have movies on the laptop. And," she paused dramatically, "we have cleaning." Daniel groaned, but Elena clapped her hands. "I like cleaning," she declared, though Isabella knew her enthusiasm would last about 10 minutes. By late morning, they were in the park. The air was crisp, the grass damp from last night's rain. Elena ran ahead, her laughter ringing out as she chased pigeons, her arms flapping like wings. Daniel jogged after her, pretending to be a monster, while Isabella followed at a slower pace, her eyes lingering on the way the sunlight caught in her daughter's hair. They had passed this park 100 times before, always rushing somewhere else, always too busy or too tired. Today, it felt like a sanctuary. They sat on a worn wooden bench, watching Elena climb the jungle gym. Daniel stretched his arms behind his head, exhaling deeply. "You know," he said, "this doesn't cost a thing, but she's happier than she ever is when we go out and spend money." Isabella nodded, her chest swelling with quiet pride. "Maybe happiness isn't in the spending," she said softly. Daniel chuckled. "Don't tell the commercials." They stayed until the sun dipped lower, until Elena's cheeks flushed pink with cold and her hands were sticky from an apple Isabella had packed from home. Back at the apartment, they ate reheated beans and rice from the fridge. Elena insisted on setting the table herself, placing mismatched napkins beside each plate with the seriousness of a maitre d'. After dinner, Isabella pulled out a deck of cards from the drawer. They played Go Fish, then Rummy, then a messy version of solitaire that Elena insisted was family solitaire. The room filled with laughter and playful arguments. Daniel accused Isabella of cheating. Isabella rolled her eyes dramatically. Elena declared herself the winner of every round. When the games ended, they piled onto the couch, huddled under a blanket, and opened the laptop to watch an old DVD Isabella had borrowed from the library weeks ago. The screen flickered, the sound tinny, but none of that mattered. Elena's head rested on Isabella's shoulder, Daniel's arm draped lazily across the back of the couch. For the first time in a long time, the weekend didn't feel like an escape from the week. It felt like a part of life worth keeping. Sunday morning arrived with gray skies and the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the window. The apartment smelled of coffee and oatmeal, the familiar fragrance of their new rituals. Isabella leaned against the counter, mug in hand, watching Daniel and Elena build another fort in the living room. The rain made the world outside feel distant, almost irrelevant. Inside, their tiny apartment pulsed with warmth. After breakfast, Isabella gathered the family for the dreaded cleaning session. Daniel groaned dramatically, collapsing on the couch, while Elena skipped around with a rag in hand, shouting, "I'm the dust queen." Together, they scrubbed counters, folded laundry, sorted through toys. Isabella found 3-in-use coloring books tucked behind a pile of papers, treasures forgotten. Elena squealed with delight, spreading them out on the floor as if they were new gifts. Daniel found a pair of old headphones tangled in a drawer and laughed. Didn't even know we had these. By afternoon, the apartment felt lighter, tidier. The clutter that once suffocated them gave way to space, however small, that felt breathable. As evening fell, Isabella sat at the table with her notebook, recording the weekend. No spend weekend equals success. She wrote the words slowly, deliberately. The numbers confirmed it. They hadn't touched the entertainment envelope. They hadn't swiped the credit card. They had lived, laughed, eaten, and played, and spent nothing. But the true success wasn't financial. It was emotional. They had proven to themselves that joy didn't have to come with a receipt. That togetherness was richer than any restaurant meal. That cardboard forts and borrowed DVDs could outshine amusement parks and takeout. Daniel came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "What are you writing?" She tilted the notebook so he could see. He smiled softly, leaning down to kiss her temple. "You're changing us, Isabella." She closed the notebook gently, her hand resting on the cover. "No," she whispered. "We're changing together." And as the rain pattered against the window, as Elena's laughter echoed from the living room fort, Isabella realized something profound. It wasn't just about saving money. It was about redefining wealth. Wealth wasn't in dollars or things. It was in moments, in choices, in a weekend without spending. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic tapping of Isabella's pen against her notebook. The pages, once intimidatingly blank, were now crowded with numbers, arrows, and underlined words. Tonight, though, she was not simply recording expenses. She was plotting their first true attack against the mountain of debt that had shadowed them for years. Daniel sat across from her, elbows on the table, his brow furrowed as he studied the neat columns Isabella had drawn. "So this is it. This is the snowball thing you've been talking about." Isabella nodded, her curls falling forward as she leaned over the notebook. "Yes, it's simple, but it works. We pay the minimums on every debt, except the smallest one. That one, we throw every extra dollar at until it's gone. Then we take what we were paying there and roll into the next. The momentum builds, like a snowball rolling downhill." Daniel frowned. "Shouldn't we tackle the one with the highest interest first? That seems smarter." "I thought that too," Isabella admitted. "But the research shows people stick with it when they feel wins early. Paying off something small gives us motivation to keep going. Right now, we need momentum more than math." Daniel rubbed his jaw, still skeptical. But he didn't argue. He had seen what her envelopes and meal prepping had already done for their budget. For the first time, there was hope where before there had only been frustration. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it your way." Isabella turned the notebook so he could see. On the page, for debts were listed in order of size. Credit card number 1, $650. Medical bill, $1,200. Credit card number 2, $4,800. Personal loan, $13,350. Credit card 1, Isabella said, tapping her pen against the smallest balance. "That's our first target." Daniel raised his eyebrows. $650. That'll take months. "Not if we focus," Isabella countered. She flipped to another page where she had calculated their new budget. Between meal prepping, no-spend weekends, and cutting extras, we saved nearly $300 this month. If we keep that up, plus our regular payments, we can knock this out in 3 months. Maybe 2. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. The idea of being rid of even one debt, no matter how small, seemed almost unreal. And then, Isabella said, her voice steady with determination, "We take that payment and roll it into the medical bill." And so on, one by one, until they're gone. The first payment was anticlimactic. Isabella stood at the counter, debit card in hand, staring at the computer screen. The minimum payment was $30. She typed in $200, her hand trembling slightly as she clicked submit. The confirmation appeared on the screen. Payment successful. Isabella exhaled, her shoulders slumping in relief. She hadn't expected to feel so much over a transaction. But it wasn't just money leaving their account. It was weight leaving her chest. When Daniel came home that evening, she told him, her eyes shining. "200 down," she said proudly. "Only $450 to go." He grinned, pulling her into a hug. "We're really doing this." The next 2 months were a test of discipline. Every decision seemed to revolve around one question. Does this get us closer to paying off the card? When Elena begged for ice cream on a Wednesday evening, Isabella improvised, making frozen banana ice cream in the blender instead. When Daniel's coworkers invited him to lunch, he declined politely, pulling his homemade beans and rice from the break room fridge. When Isabella's coworkers bought new shoes on payday, she reminded herself of a number circled in her notebook, $650. Every small sacrifice became a dollar freed, a dollar redirected to the snowball. They celebrated small wins. When they made an extra $50 payment, they high-fived like children. When Isabella sold an unused blender online for $25, Elena insisted on putting the cash into the dead envelope herself, declaring proudly, "We're crushing it." Each time the balance dropped, Isabella updated the notebook, writing the new number in bold. Watching the digits shrink felt intoxicating. One Saturday evening, after dinner, Isabella sat cross-legged on the floor, the notebook open in her lap. Daniel joined her, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. "We're down $150, she whispered, almost reverently. Daniel blinked. "That's it. That's it." They stared at each other for a long moment, the weight of the progress settling over them. 2 weeks later, Isabella made the final payment. She clicked submit and leaned back, covering her mouth with her hands as the confirmation appeared. Balance, $0. Her heart pounded. She whispered the number out loud. 0. Daniel came rushing into the room when he heard her shout. She turned the screen toward him, her face flushed with excitement. "Look," she said. "It's gone. The first one is gone." Daniel stared at the screen, then back at her. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, wide and unrestrained. He pulled her into his arms, spinning her around in the small kitchen until she laughed breathlessly. From the bedroom, Elena's voice rang out, confused but delighted. "Why are you guys yelling?" "Because," Daniel shouted back, "we just paid off our first debt." Elena came running in, her hair a wild halo around her face. She jumped up and down, clapping her hands. "Does that mean we're rich now?" Isabella laughed, pulling her daughter close. "Not yet, Carino. But it means we're free of one chain. And soon more." That night, after Elena was asleep, Isabella sat at the kitchen table, staring at the notebook. She crossed out credit card number 1 with bold strokes, the ink digging deep into the paper. Then she looked at the next number. Medical bill, $1,200. For a moment, she felt the familiar wave of overwhelm. $1,200 was still daunting. And beyond that, nearly $18,000 remained. But then she glanced back at the crossed-out line, the victory inked into permanence. They had done it once. They could do it again. She wrote in the margin beside the medical bill, snowball rolling. The following weeks felt different. There was a spark in the air, a lightness in their steps. The discipline that had once felt like sacrifice now felt like power. Every meal prepped, every dollar saved, every no-spend weekend was fuel for the snowball. Daniel began picking up small overtime shifts, knowing each extra hour chipped away at the medical bill. Isabella started babysitting for a neighbor on Saturday nights, tucking the cash directly into the dead envelope. Even Elena contributed, proudly saving coins in a jar labeled Family Fund. The momentum grew. One evening, Isabella sat with Daniel at the table, notebook open, showing him the new total. "We're down to $700, she said, her voice trembling with pride. Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "We've already cut it almost in half." "Yes," Isabella said. "And when this one's gone, we'll have another $100 each month to roll into the next." She paused, staring at the numbers. "Do you see it? This is how we climb out. Not all at once, but step by step." Daniel reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "I see it," he said softly. By the time spring arrived, the medical bill was gone. Another line crossed out. Another weight lifted. Isabella stood at the counter with her notebook, her pen poised above the page. She crossed through the $1,200 line slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. Then she underlined the next target, credit card number 2, $4,800. The number looked enormous compared to what they had faced before, but Isabella felt no fear, only determination. The snowball had begun, and it wasn't stopping. The apartment felt smaller than usual that Saturday morning. Sunlight streamed in through the blinds, catching the edges of boxes stacked haphazardly in the corner of the living room. Toys Elena had outgrown, kitchen gadgets they barely touched, clothes that hadn't been worn in years. Isabella stood in the middle of it all, arms crossed, scanning the clutter with a determined expression. Daniel watched from the couch, sipping his coffee, clearly skeptical. "So," he said slowly, "you want to sell our stuff?" "Not our stuff," Isabella corrected, her curls bouncing slightly as she shook her head. "The stuff we don't need. The stuff that's just sitting there, taking up space. Every dollar we make goes straight to the snowball." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You think anyone's going to pay for that old blender?" "Maybe not," Isabella admitted, "but someone might. And even if it's just $20, that's 20 less we owe." She pulled out her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, she had written in bold letters, "Declutter equals debt crusher." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You and your slogans. They help," Isabella said simply. "They keep me focused." The process began in Elena's room. Isabella knelt on the floor, pulling out bins of toys and clothes. Elena sat cross-legged beside her, clutching a faded stuffed rabbit. "Mommy," she said, her voice small, "we can't sell Mr. Nibbles." Isabella smiled gently, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Of course not, Carino. Some things we keep forever. But what about these?" She held up a set of plastic blocks that had been gathering dust in the corner. Elena tilted her head, considering. "I don't play with them anymore." "Then maybe another little girl will," Isabella said softly. "And the money can help us pay for fun things in the future." Elena thought for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "Okay, but Mr. Nibbles stays." "Mr. Nibbles stays," Isabella agreed, placing the rabbit safely on the bed. The living room became a staging ground. Daniel pulled out old electronics, an MP3 player, a set of tangled headphones, a DVD player that hadn't been used since streaming took over. Isabella sorted through the kitchen cabinets, finding duplicate spatulas, a waffle iron they had used twice, and 3 mismatched mugs. By the end of the morning, the piles had grown. One for donations, one for trash, and one, most important, for selling. Daniel stared at the sell pile, rubbing his chin. "This actually looks like money." "Told you," Isabella said, grinning. The next step was listing. Isabella spread the items across the table, taking pictures with her phone. She angled the shots carefully, making even the old waffle iron look appealing. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, smirking. "You're like a marketing pro. Desperate people get creative," Isabella replied with a laugh. She uploaded the photos to Facebook Marketplace, typing descriptions with meticulous detail. "Gently used. Still works perfectly. Smoke-free home." She posted other items on eBay, learning how to set starting bids and shipping costs. At first, there was silence. Hours passed with no messages, no offers. Isabella felt the familiar tug of doubt in her chest. Maybe Daniel had been right. Maybe no one wanted their cast-offs. But then a ping. Her phone buzzed with a message. "Is the DVD player still available?" Isabella's heart leapt. She typed back quickly. "Yes, it is." By that evening, a stranger had come to their apartment door and handed her $15 cash. Isabella stared at the bills in her hand, the weight of them heavier than their value. $15, she whispered. That's groceries for 2 days. Daniel grinned. And the snowball grows. Over the next week, the sales trickled in. $20 for the waffle iron, $10 for the headphones, $30 for a set of unused curtains Isabella had found in the back of the closet. Each time, Isabella logged the amount in her notebook, her pen pressing the numbers into permanence. Each dollar was a tiny victory, proof that they could transform clutter into freedom. The apartment began to feel different too. With every box carried out the door, the rooms seemed to breathe easier. Space opened up on shelves. Drawers closed without force. The living room no longer felt suffocated by things they didn't use. One evening, Isabella stood in the middle of the apartment, looking around. "You feel that?" she asked Daniel. He tilted his head. "Feel what?" "The space," Isabella said, spreading her arms. "It feels lighter, like the air is clearer." Daniel looked around, then nodded slowly. "You're right. It doesn't feel so cramped." "It's not just the apartment," Isabella said softly. "It's us. We're shedding the weight." By the end of the month, they had made $300 from selling and used items. Isabella placed the cash into the dead envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she counted it. 300, she whispered. "That's half a month's progress in one go." Daniel let out a low whistle. "From stuff we didn't even use." Isabella smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Exactly. We were surrounded by money. We just didn't see it. But the process wasn't only financial. It was emotional too." One evening, Isabella found herself holding an old dress she had bought years ago, tags still attached. She had purchased it on a whim during a sale, convincing herself she would wear it someday. But someday had never come. She sat on the edge of the bed, the dress draped across her lap. It was beautiful, yes, but it represented something else too. Impulse, regret, money wasted. Daniel walked in, pausing when he saw her. "You okay?" Isabella nodded slowly. "I think so. I used to buy things like this when I felt empty. Like buying would fill the hole." She held up the dress, studying it in the soft light. "But it never did. It just left me with less money and more clutter." Daniel sat beside her, resting his hand over hers. "Well, now it can fill the snowball instead." Isabella laughed softly, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "Yeah, now it has a purpose." She folded the dress carefully and placed it in the sell pile. The sales continued. Some items fetched only a few dollars, others a bit more. But each transaction was a step forward, a reminder that progress wasn't only about earning. It was also about releasing. Elena joined in too, proudly selling a toy kitchen set she had outgrown. When the buyer handed her $10, she ran to Isabella, waving the bill. "Look, Mommy, I helped crush the debt." Isabella hugged her tightly, her heart swelling. "Yes, you did, Carino. You helped more than you know." By the second month, the total reached nearly $600. Isabella added it to the snowball, watching as their credit card balance shrank faster than she had imagined possible. The clutter was gone. The apartment felt like theirs again. And the money they had once thought was lost forever, was now fueling their freedom. One evening, Isabella sat at the table with her notebook, flipping back through the pages. She saw the line she had written weeks ago, "Declutter equals debt crusher." She smiled, adding a new note beneath it. Less stuff, more freedom. For the first time, she believed it fully. The first thing Isabella noticed was the silence. It wasn't that the apartment had ever been loud, exactly, but the clutter had created a kind of noise of its own. Stacks of papers, clothes draped over chairs, toys scattered across the floor, each one a tiny reminder of something unfinished, something unresolved. But now, after weeks of selling, donating, and clearing, the noise had quieted. The living room looked different. Not empty, but intentional. The couch sat unburdened by piles of laundry. The bookshelf held only the volumes they truly loved, their spines straight, their colors muted and comforting. Elena's toys fit neatly into a single bin. The coffee table, once buried under forgotten mail and receipts, now held only a small plant Isabella had been gifted years ago. Daniel walked in from work one evening, stopping short as he surveyed the room. "It feels bigger," he said slowly. "It's not bigger," Isabella replied, smiling softly as she wiped down the table. It's just less full. Daniel set down his bag, looking around with new eyes. Feels lighter too. Isabella nodded, her chest swelling with pride. She hadn't just cleaned. She had shifted something deeper. That night, after Elena was asleep, Isabella sat at the table with her notebook. She drew a line down the page, writing 2 words at the top, before and after. Under before, she scribbled, cluttered, rushed, always searching, always buying. Under after, she wrote, intentional, calm, less stress, more space. She stared at the words for a long time, her pen hovering above the paper. A thought pressed against her, insistent and undeniable. This wasn't just decluttering. This was something bigger. Minimalism. The word felt foreign on her tongue, like it belonged to people in glossy magazines with stark white furniture and closets that looked more like art galleries than storage spaces. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized minimalism wasn't about perfection. It was about purpose, about stripping away what didn't matter so that what did could shine. She whispered the word into the quiet kitchen. Minimalism. The next morning, Isabella broached the subject with Daniel over breakfast. So, I've been thinking, she began cautiously, stirring sugar into her coffee. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That's never good. She rolled her eyes, but smiled. What if we didn't just declutter? What if we actually lived with less? On purpose. Daniel chewed his toast slowly, considering. You mean like minimalists? Yes. He leaned back, scratching his chin. Aren't minimalists those people who live with like 1 chair and 2 shirts? Isabella laughed. Not exactly. It doesn't have to be extreme. It just means choosing carefully, keeping what adds value, letting go of what doesn't. Daniel shrugged. Sounds doable. As long as you don't throw away my baseball glove. Your glove stays, Isabella promised. But the 3 broken toasters in the cabinet, they go. He grinned. Fair enough. They started small. Isabella tackled the kitchen first, pulling everything from the cabinets and spreading it across the counters. Duplicate spatulas. 3 can openers. 5 chipped mugs. She sorted them into piles, keeping only what they truly used. Daniel joined in, reluctantly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Why do we even own this? He asked, holding up a fondue pot still in its box. Isabella laughed. Because I thought someday we'd throw a fondue party. And did we? No, she admitted. Then goodbye, fondue dreams, Daniel said dramatically, placing in the donation pile. Elena joined too, sorting her toys with surprising maturity. She lined them up on the floor, touching each one gently. This one I play with, she said, setting aside her dollhouse. This one I don't. She placed a plastic truck into the donation box. Isabella watched her daughter with pride. You're really good at this, Carino. Elena shrugged. It feels nice to give things away. Like they'll make someone else happy. Isabella blinked, her throat tightening. Out of the mouths of children, she thought. Minimalism wasn't about loss. It was about joy. The more they let go, the more space they created, not just in their apartment, but in their lives. Without piles of dishes crowding the cabinets, cooking felt less stressful. Without clothes stuffed into drawers, laundry became simpler. Without toys scattered across the floor, evenings became calmer. But it wasn't only about convenience. It was about clarity. One Saturday morning, Isabella sat on the freshly cleared couch, sipping coffee. The sunlight streamed through the window, falling across the floor in golden squares. She looked around at the space, uncluttered, intentional, calm, and felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. Of course, not everyone understood. When Isabella's sister, Marisol, visited one afternoon, she looked around the pared-down apartment with raised eyebrows. Where's all your stuff? She asked, scanning the nearly bare walls. Isabella smiled. We got rid of what we didn't need. Marisol frowned. But, doesn't it feel empty? Not empty. Isabella corrected. Free. Marisol shook her head, unconvinced. I like my things. That's fine, Isabella said gently. This isn't about having nothing. It's about having what matters. For us, that means less. Marisol shrugged, clearly unconvinced, but Isabella didn't mind. Minimalism wasn't about impressing anyone else. It was about creating space for what mattered most to them. The biggest change came not in their apartment, but in their spending habits. Before, shopping had been both necessity and pastime. A quick trip to the store always seemed to end with impulse purchases. A candle here, a shirt there, little things that added up. But now, minimalism gave them a filter. Each time Isabella considered a purchase, she asked herself, does this add value? Does this serve a purpose? More often than not, the answer was no. She stopped browsing online stores just to look. She unsubscribed from marketing emails. When friends invited her to go shopping, she suggested coffee in the park instead. And for the first time, she didn't feel deprived. She felt free. Daniel experienced the shift too. One evening, he stood in front of his closet, staring at the crowded rack of shirts. He pulled out a button-down with the tag still on it, shaking his head. I bought this 2 years ago, he admitted. Never wore it once. Isabella leaned against the doorframe, smiling knowingly. Want to donate it? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, feels stupid to keep it. He tossed it into the donation bag, then looked back at the closet. You know what? I only wear the same 5 shirts anyway. Why do I even keep the rest? He pulled out a stack, adding them to the bag. Isabella watched, her heart swelling. Minimalism wasn't just her idea anymore. It was becoming theirs. Over time, the Riveras developed their own minimalist rules. One in, one out. If they brought something new into the house, something old had to leave. The 24-hour rule. If they wanted to buy something, they waited a full day before making the purchase. Most of the time, the desire faded. The value test. Everything they kept had to serve a purpose or bring genuine joy. If it didn't, it went. These rules weren't strict commandments. They were guides, helping them live intentionally instead of reactively. The financial impact was undeniable. With fewer impulse purchases, their spending dropped dramatically. Their savings grew. The debt snowball rolled faster. But the emotional impact was even greater. Evenings felt calmer. Weekends were no longer filled with errands and shopping trips, but with walks in the park, family meals, and quiet moments together. The apartment, once a cramped and chaotic space, now felt like a sanctuary. One night, Isabella lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the journey they had started, from drowning in clutter and debt to finding peace and purpose in simplicity. She whispered into the dark, a quiet vow to herself. Less stuff, more life. And she meant it. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon, slipped casually into Isabella's inbox between work emails and school reminders. She almost deleted it without opening, assuming it was another ad or spam message. But when she saw the subject line, exclusive friends and family sale, 40% off this weekend only, her breath caught. It was her favorite clothing store, the one she had avoided for months, ever since adopting her new minimalist mindset. Her finger hovered over the delete button, but something inside her whispered, just look. She clicked. Bright photos filled the screen, models in crisp dresses, cozy sweaters, boots that gleamed under perfect lighting. The kind of outfits Isabella had always imagined herself in, the ones that promised a version of her life more glamorous, more put together. Her heart quickened. It had been so long since she had bought something just for herself. She imagined the thrill of carrying a shopping bag, of peeling off tags, of slipping into something new. Then came the second whisper, quieter but firmer. Does this add value? Or does it add debt? Isabella closed the laptop abruptly, her cheeks flushed. She stood up, pacing the small kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't want it, but she did. That evening, she tried to bury the temptation beneath routine. She cooked lentil soup, helped Elena with her homework, folded laundry. But the thought lingered, a dull hum in the back of her mind. When Daniel came home, she debated telling him, but shame held her tongue. Instead, she smiled, asked about his day, and kissed him good night as if nothing was wrong. But in the dark, as she lay awake, she imagined herself at the store, slipping into dresses, hearing the cashier say, "That'll be $89.99. The number sliced through her fantasy. $89. That was 2 weeks of groceries. That was half a payment toward their snowball. She turned on her side, staring at the shadow of Daniel's sleeping form. For the first time since they'd started this journey, she felt the tug-of-war between her old self and her new self pulling her in opposite directions. The test didn't stop with the email. On Friday afternoon, Marisol called. "You're coming to the sale, right?" her sister asked, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Everyone's going." It's this weekend only. Isabella's stomach twisted. I don't know, Marisol. We're trying to be careful with money. Oh, come on. Marisol pressed. You've been so good. You deserve to treat yourself. Besides, it's basically free at 40% off. Isabella laughed softly, though it felt hollow. It's not free if I spend money I don't have. Marisol sighed dramatically. You've changed. You used to be fun. The words stung, though Isabella knew they weren't meant cruelly. Still, when she hung up the phone, she felt the weight of them. Had she lost part of herself in this process? Had frugality and minimalism made her boring, rigid, less alive? The temptation grew sharper. Saturday morning dawned bright and crisp. Isabella avoided her phone, afraid to see more ads or reminders about the sale. She focused on Elena, making pancakes from scratch, watching her daughter drizzle syrup with glee. But even as she laughed with Elena, her thoughts drifted. Daniel noticed. What's on your mind? He asked, pouring himself coffee. Isabella hesitated. Then she told him everything. The email, the sale, Marisol's invitation, the gnawing urge to buy something just for herself. Daniel listened quietly, nodding. When she finished, she braced herself for judgment. Instead, he said gently, I get it. I really do. I feel it too. Sometimes. That pull. You do? Isabella asked, surprised. Of course, he said. When my coworkers buy new gadgets, when I see ad for the latest tools or gear, I want it too. But then I remember why we're doing this. He reached across the table, taking her hand. We're not depriving ourselves. We're choosing something better. Freedom. Isabella swallowed hard, her eyes burning. But what if I fail? Daniel squeezed her hand. Then we start again. But I don't think you will. You're stronger than you know. Still, the test wasn't over. That afternoon, Isabella and Elena went to the library. As they walked through the plaza, Isabella saw the store across the street, its windows plastered with sale signs in bold red letters. Her pulse quickened. The mannequins in the window seemed to mock her, their perfect outfits a reminder of what she was denying herself. Mommy, look. Elena tugged at her hand, pointing toward the library doors. Story time. Isabella tore her gaze from the store, forcing a smile. Yes, let's go, Carino. But as they settled into the children's section, listening to the librarian's cheerful voice, Isabella felt the pull again. The store was just across the street. She could slip in after story time, just for a peek. No one would know. Her heart pounded. She knew the truth, though. A peek always leads to a purchase. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. She pictured her notebook, the debts shrinking one by one. She pictured the day they would make their last payment, the freedom that would flood their lives. Slowly, the pull began to weaken. That night, Isabella made a decision. She pulled out her notebook and turned to a blank page. At the top, she wrote, Why we choose less. She filled the page with reasons: freedom from debt, more time together, peace in their home, teaching Elena the value of simplicity. She underlined each one, anchoring herself to them. Then she turned to Daniel, who sat beside her on the couch. I need a reminder, she said, for when the temptations come. Together, they created a list of anti-temptation tools. Wait 24 hours before buying anything. Talk it out with each other. Write down the true cost, not just in dollars, but in time and trade-offs. Remember the goal: freedom. Isabella pinned the list to the fridge, a shield against future battles. On Sunday afternoon, Marisol called again. So, did you go? No, Isabella said firmly, her voice steady. I didn't. Marisol groaned. You're impossible. Maybe, Isabella replied, smiling softly. But I'm free. She hung up the phone, her chest swelling with pride. The temptation had been real. The struggle had been sharp. But Isabella had faced it and stood her ground. And in doing so, she discovered something deeper. Minimalism wasn't about living without. It was about living with strength. As she tucked Elena into bed that night, Isabella whispered a quiet promise to herself. I will not go back. And for the first time, she believed she truly wouldn't. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of day that began like any other. Isabella was running late, rushing Elena out the door with her backpack half-zipped, her curls wild under a crooked headband. Daniel had already left for work, and Isabella was juggling her coffee, her purse, and Elena's lunchbox when she noticed it. A flat tire. The front passenger side sagged against the curb, the rubber slack and defeated. Isabella's heart sank. She set the coffee on the hood, pressing her hand to her forehead. "Why is the car broken, Mommy?" Elena asked, peering around her. "It's just a flat tire, Carino," Isabella said, forcing calm into her voice. "We'll figure it out." But inside, panic churned. A flat meant money. Money they hadn't budgeted. Money that would come out of the snowball. Daniel met her at the repair shop later that morning. He stood with the mechanic, arms crossed, jaw tight. Isabella sat in the waiting room, her stomach twisted into knots, Elena doodling happily beside her with crayons. The mechanic returned with a clipboard. "It's not just the tire," he explained. "The other 3 are worn down too. You're looking at replacement. All 4. Safety issue." Isabella's heart dropped. "How much?" The mechanic glanced at his sheet. 520. The number rang in her ears, heavy and merciless. $520. Nearly 2 months of snowball progress. She glanced at Daniel. His jaw clenched, his eyes closed briefly. But when he opened them, he nodded. "Do it. We can't risk safety." The mechanic scribbled notes and walked away. Isabella stared at Daniel, her voice barely a whisper. $500. He sat beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "We'll figure it out." The payment stung. As Isabella swiped her debit card, she felt the snowball sputter, momentum slipping away. It wasn't just money leaving their account. It was progress undone. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, the new balance circled in red. Their next debt target, the credit card, had barely budged this month. Daniel placed a steaming mug of tea in front of her, sitting down with a sigh. "We had no choice." "I know," Isabella said softly, her pen tapping the page. "But it feels like we're moving backward." Daniel leaned forward, catching her gaze. "We're not. We're still out of debt on 2 accounts. We've built momentum. This is just a detour." Isabella closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. A detour, not a derailment. The week that followed was heavy. Every time Isabella saw the notebook, she felt the weight of those missing dollars. But then she remembered something she had written weeks ago. Progress over perfection. She decided to treat the expense as a lesson. Unexpected costs weren't obstacles. They were part of the journey. So she gathered the family at the table one Friday evening, pulling out envelopes and markers. "We need a new system," she declared. Elena tilted her head. "Another envelope, Mommy?" Isabella smiled. "Yes, Carino. This one's for emergencies." She labeled a fresh envelope "car repairs / unexpected. Then she pulled out $20 from their grocery savings and slipped it inside. "It's small," she admitted, "but it's a start. Every week, we'll add a little. That way, when something happens, we're ready." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Smart. Like a cushion." "Exactly," Isabella said. "A cushion for life's bumps." The cushion grew slowly. $10 here, 20 there. Sometimes nothing at all. But each deposit brought a sense of security that eased Isabella's heart. Still, discipline was tested again. 2 weeks later, Elena came home from school with a flyer in her backpack. "Field trip, Zoo Day. Cost, $25. Isabella held the paper in her hands, her heart torn. $25 wasn't catastrophic, but wasn't nothing, either. Daniel saw her hesitation. "She should go," he said gently. "She'll remember it forever." Isabella nodded, biting her lip. "But that's one less payment toward debt." Daniel reached for her hand. "We're not robots. We're parents. Debt is important, but so is living." Elena peeked into the room, her eyes wide. "Can I go, Mommy? Please." Isabella's chest softened. She smiled, pulling her daughter close. "Yes, Carino. You can go." She slipped the 25 from the envelope, reminding herself, freedom wasn't just about numbers. It was about balance. By spring, another curveball arrived. Daniel's hours at work were cut temporarily due to restructuring. The paycheck shrank by nearly a third. The news hit like a storm. Isabella sat at the kitchen table, staring at the numbers, her stomach twisting. Daniel rubbed his temples. "It's just for a month, maybe 2, he assured her. "But it's going to hurt." They reworked the budget ruthlessly. Entertainment, 0. Dining out, 0. Even groceries were shaved down further, relying on beans, rice, and bulk staples. Isabella watched as the snowball slowed, almost to a stop. The red numbers in her notebook looked mocking, like the debt was laughing at their efforts. But she refused to give in. "This isn't failure," she told Daniel firmly one night, her eyes blazing. "This is training. Life is teaching us resilience." He looked at her, weary but inspired. "Resilience," he echoed. "I like that." The cuts were hard. They skipped birthday gifts for themselves, crafting handmade cards instead. They walked to the park for free entertainment, watching Elena play under the trees instead of going to movies. And yet, something unexpected bloomed in the struggle: creativity. Isabella discovered dozens of free resources: library books, streaming documentaries, online classes. Daniel borrowed tools from neighbors instead of buying new. They swapped recipes with friends, learning to make homemade tortillas and soups. Life grew simpler, yes, but also grew richer. 2 months later, Daniel's hours returned to normal. The first full paycheck felt like a victory, the relief palpable. That evening, Isabella opened her notebook, circling the next debt balance with renewed determination. "We survived," she whispered, "and now we fight harder." Daniel raised his mug in a toast to resilience. They clinked mugs, smiling through tired but determined eyes. Looking back, Isabella realized the unexpected expenses hadn't ruined their progress. They had deepened it. They had learned to plan for emergencies, to adapt when income fell, to choose experiences over perfection. Most importantly, they had learned that financial freedom wasn't about avoiding storms. It was about learning how to stand steady in the rain. And that, Isabella knew, was a lesson worth every dollar. The idea first flickered late one evening, when the apartment was quiet and the city outside buzzed faintly with distant traffic. Isabella sat at the kitchen table, her notebook open, numbers scrawled across the page. The debts were shrinking, yes, but painfully slowly. The unexpected expenses had eaten their cushion, and while progress continued, it felt like trudging through mud. Daniel walked in, rubbing the back of his neck after a long shift. He dropped his work bag with a thud and glanced at the table. "Still crunching numbers?" Isabella sighed, closing the notebook gently. "We're doing everything right, but it's just so slow. I keep thinking, if we could just earn a little more, we could speed this up." Daniel slumped into the chair across from her, chuckling ruefully. Easier said than done. But Isabella didn't laugh. Her eyes were steady, glowing with something that wasn't quite desperation, more like resolve. "What if we tried? A side hustle. Something small, just to throw extra at the snowball." Daniel leaned back, skeptical. "Like what?" "I already work late. You're juggling Elena, the house, and your shifts. We're stretched thin as it is." "Not something big," Isabella said quickly. "Just opportunities. We have skills. We have time. Well, some time. Maybe we can make it work." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Side hustle, huh? Okay, tell me. What's in that head of yours?" Isabella's first idea was simple: meal prepping for neighbors. She had grown adept at stretching ingredients, making lentils taste like comfort food and rice into something almost elegant. What if she prepared extra batches and sold them for a modest price? She tested the idea with Marisol, who had often joked about paying Isabella to cook for her. "Are you serious?" Marisol exclaimed over the phone. "If you made those black bean enchiladas every week, I'd buy them in a heartbeat." "I hate cooking after work." Isabella smiled, hope flickering. "Maybe I'll try a small batch, see how it goes." The following Saturday, she prepared 10 enchilada trays in disposable tins, neatly labeled with reheating instructions. She listed them in a local moms group online, pricing them modestly at $15 each. Within 2 hours, they were gone. That evening, Isabella laid out the cash on the table, her hands trembling slightly. $150. From food she knew how to make, from skills she already had. Daniel stared at the bills, whistling low. "Well, I'll be damned. You just made more in one day than I did all week in overtime." Isabella laughed, the sound bubbling with relief. "It's not much, but it's something, and something adds up." Meanwhile, Daniel began exploring his own options. He had always been handy, fixing leaky faucets, patching drywall, tinkering with old electronics. What if he turned those skills outward? He started by offering to assemble furniture for neighbors. The first gig came from a single mom who had ordered a complicated IKEA bunk bed. "It would have taken me a week," she admitted gratefully as Daniel tightened the last bolt. She handed him $60 in cash, her smile genuine. "You saved me." Daniel walked home that evening taller than usual, the money folded in his pocket. He felt useful, not just at work, but in his own right. When he placed the bills on the table beside Isabella's enchilada earnings, they both stared at the pile, their eyes wide. "This," Daniel said softly, "is the snowball getting rocket fuel." At first, the side hustles were experiments, scattered and tentative. Isabella sold enchiladas some weekends. Daniel picked up odd jobs here and there. But as weeks turned into months, patterns emerged. Isabella expanded her menu. Tamales, soups, even simple family-style casseroles. She discovered that busy parents and elderly neighbors were eager for affordable, homemade meals. Word spread quickly, orders grew, and soon she was preparing 20 trays every Saturday. Daniel, meanwhile, became the go-to fix-it guy in their building. Neighbors knocked on their door with broken shelves, wobbly tables, and squeaky doors. He charged modestly, but the jobs added up. Together, they tracked every dollar, funneling it straight into their debt payments. Some weeks, they added an extra $200 to the snowball. Other weeks, nearly $400. The progress was staggering, but the money wasn't the only reward. The side hustles brought something else, pride. One evening, Isabella stood at the stove, stirring a pot of tamale filling. Elena sat at the counter, carefully folding foil around enchiladas. "Look, Mommy, I'm helping," Elena said proudly. Isabella smiled, her heart swelling. "Yes, you are, Carino. You're part of the team." Daniel entered, wiping grease from his hands after fixing a neighbor's chair. He kissed Isabella on the cheek, glancing at the trays lining the counter. "You're building an empire in here." Isabella laughed. "Hardly. Just a side hustle." But deep inside, she felt something stirring, something bigger than money. A sense of agency. A belief that they weren't at the mercy of circumstances. They could create. They could provide. They could fight back. Of course, it wasn't easy. Some Saturdays, Isabella woke before dawn, chopping onions while the world outside still slept. Some evenings, Daniel dragged himself home, his back aching from hours of bending and lifting. There were times they argued over exhaustion, snapping at each other in the cluttered kitchen. Times when Isabella wondered if the hustle was worth the strain. But each time doubt crept in, they looked at the notebook, at the shrinking balances, at the debt that once felt like a mountain, now eroding under their combined force. And each time, the answer was the same. Yes. It was worth it. Their efforts began to ripple outward. One afternoon, Isabella's neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, stopped by as Isabella carried trays to her car. "You remind me of my mother," Mrs. Lopez said warmly. "She worked hard, sold food to pay the bills. I'm proud of you." Isabella's eyes stung with tears. She hadn't realized her little hustle could inspire anyone else. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself mentoring a teenager in the building who wanted to learn basic handyman skills. "Teach me, Mr. Rivera," the boy asked eagerly. Daniel chuckled, handing him a wrench. "All right, kid. Lesson 1. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey." For the first time in years, Daniel and Isabella felt not just like debt fighters, but like contributors to something bigger. By late summer, the results were undeniable. The extra income had allowed them to wipe out one more debt entirely, a lingering credit card balance that had haunted Isabella for years. She crossed it out in her notebook with bold strokes, her hand trembling. "Gone," she whispered. "Forever gone." Daniel hugged her tightly, spinning her around the kitchen as Elena clapped and cheered. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a milestone, a victory earned not just by sacrifice, but by ingenuity. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Isabella reflected aloud. "You know what I've realized? Side hustles aren't just about money. They're about hope, about proving to ourselves that we're not stuck." Daniel nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "And about teaching Elena that we can always create, no matter what life throws at us." Isabella glanced at their daughter, curled up with a book on the rug. Her heart swelled with pride. For the first time, the future felt less like a burden and more like a canvas. The signs began quietly, so quietly that Isabella almost missed them. At first, it was just fatigue, an extra yawn while stirring tamale filling, a longer pause before getting up from the couch. Daniel brushed it off as normal. "We're working hard," he said with a grin, That's all. But over time, the fatigue deepened. Isabella felt it in her bones, a heaviness that clung even after a night's sleep. Daniel began rubbing his lower back after jobs, his smile forced, his steps slower. And then came the snapping. Short, sharp words over small things. The kind of arguments that burned hot and fast, but left a lingering ash of guilt. Why didn't you remind me we needed foil? Isabella muttered one evening, slamming the pantry door shut. I'm not your calendar. Daniel shot back, his jaw tight. They stared at each other, both startled by the sharpness. Elena, sitting at the table with her crayons, looked up with wide eyes. Isabella's heart clenched with shame. She turned back to Daniel, her voice softening. I'm sorry. I'm just tired. Daniel sighed, the tension draining from his shoulders. Me too. The hustle had started with hope, with excitement, with pride in their newfound resourcefulness. But now, weeks of 4 a.m. wake-ups and late-night jobs were grinding them down. One Saturday, Isabella stood in the kitchen surrounded by trays of enchiladas, the smell of cumin and onions heavy in the air. She leaned on the counter, dizzy. For a moment, she considered abandoning the whole batch, walking away, crawling into bed. But then Elena's voice cut through her haze. Mommy, are you okay? Isabella straightened quickly, forcing a smile. Yes, Carino. Just a little tired. Inside, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. Daniel hit his wall one evening while repairing a neighbor's table. As he bent to tighten a stubborn screw, pain shot through his lower back, sharp and searing. He froze, gripping the edge of the table, sweat beading on his forehead. Are you okay, Mr. Rivera? The neighbor asked, concerned. Daniel forced a smile, nodding. Just a cramp. But when he got home, he sank onto the couch with a groan, clutching his back. Isabella knelt beside him, worry etched on her face. This isn't sustainable, she whispered. We can't keep pushing like this. Daniel nodded reluctantly, his eyes tired. But if we stop, we slow down. Isabella took his hand, her grip firm. Better slow than broken. The truth hung heavy between them. They had built momentum, yes, but they had also built a treadmill, one that threatened to run them ragged. That night, Isabella lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of their debt-free dream, the finish line so vivid in her mind. But what good was freedom if they collapsed on the way there? She whispered into the dark, barely audible, we need balance. The next morning, Isabella made a decision. She called Marisol and asked her to take Elena for the afternoon. Then she sat Daniel down at the kitchen table, notebook open between them. No numbers today, she said firmly. Just us. Just honesty. Daniel looked wary but nodded. Isabella took a deep breath. I love what we're doing. I love the progress. But I don't love who we're becoming. Tired. Snappy. Empty. That's not freedom either. Daniel rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. I know. I feel it too. Like I'm on autopilot, just moving from one job to the next. No space to breathe. So we change, Isabella said simply. Not everything, but enough to make this sustainable. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. What do you suggest? They brainstormed together, scribbling notes in the margins of the notebook. Limit the hustle. No more than 2 extra jobs a week for Daniel. No more than 15 trays for Isabella. Rest days. 1 day a week completely off. No work, no hustles, no chores beyond the basics. Just family. Self-care budget. A tiny sliver of money set aside each month for something that brought joy. Coffee out, a book, a treat for Elena. Check-ins, weekly conversations about not just money, but how they were feeling. As the list took shape, Isabella felt her shoulders lighten. For the first time in weeks, she saw a path forward that didn't feel like collapse. Daniel squeezed her hand, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Balance. That's our new hustle. They tested the plan the very next weekend. Instead of waking before dawn to cook, Isabella slept in until 8. She made pancakes for Elena, laughing as her daughter smeared syrup across her cheeks. Daniel joined them, his back still sore, but his eyes brighter than they'd been in weeks. Later, they took a walk in the park. No trays to deliver, no furniture to fix. Just the 3 of them under the trees, the sunlight dappling through leaves, Elena chasing pigeons with glee. As they sat on a bench, Isabella leaned against Daniel, her chest swelling. This is what we're fighting for, she murmured. Daniel kissed her hair. And we're not going to lose it along the way. The balance didn't erase the fatigue overnight. There are still long days, still moments of snapping, still exhaustion. But there's also rest, joy, breath. Isabella found herself savoring the smaller batches she cooked, pouring love into each tray rather than rushing through dozens. Daniel chose his handyman jobs more carefully, focusing on ones that paid fairly and didn't strain his back. And Elena flourished. She noticed the change, the laughter returning to their evenings, the warmth in her parents' voices. One night, as they read a bedtime story, she looked up with wide eyes. I like when you're not so tired, Mommy. You smile more. Isabella's throat tightened, tears prickling her eyes. She hugged her daughter tightly, whispering, Thank you, Carino. That means everything. As weeks passed, the family began to see the fruits of their new rhythm. The debt still shrank, slower than before but steady. The notebook filled with crossed-out balances, each one a small celebration. But more importantly, their home filled with laughter again, with music on Sunday mornings, with lazy afternoons at the park. Freedom, Isabella realized, wasn't just a finish line. It was the journey itself, and balance was the compass guiding them there. One evening, as she sat with her notebook, Isabella reflected on everything they had learned. Hustle had taught them resilience, creativity, and the power of extra income. But burnout had taught them something equally vital, sustainability. She wrote a new phrase at the top of the page, circling it 3 times. Pace yourself. Freedom is a marathon, not a sprint. When Daniel joined her on the couch, she showed him the words. He smiled, nodding. That's our new mantra. Together, they leaned back, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around them. The debt still waited. The journey still stretched ahead. But they had found their stride. And that, Isabella knew, was worth more than any side hustle. The first ripple began with a tray of enchiladas. Isabella had prepared an extra batch, not for sale, but for kindness. Mrs. Lopez, their elderly neighbor down the hall, had been unwell, and Isabella thought a home-cooked meal might lift her spirits. She knocked gently, balancing the tray in her arms. Isabella, Mrs. Lopez exclaimed, her frail face breaking into a smile. You didn't have to. I wanted to. Isabella replied warmly. Please enjoy. Mrs. Lopez's eyes glistened as she took the tray. Your mother will be proud. You've got her heart. Isabella walked back down the hall, her chest swelling with quiet pride. She hadn't expected anything in return, but that one gesture set something in motion. The next week, Mrs. Lopez knocked on their door with a bag of ripe tomatoes from her small balcony garden. For your cooking, she said, pressing them into Isabella's hands. Word spread in the building. Soon, neighbors began offering small exchanges. A tray of food for a bag of fresh herbs. A fixed chair in return for help with laundry. A Saturday of babysitting traded for a Sunday of handyman work. It wasn't formal. It wasn't organized. But slowly, the Riveras became the heartbeat of a quiet network of support. One Saturday, Daniel returned from helping a neighbor patch drywall, carrying not cash but a box of tools. He said he doesn't need them anymore, Daniel explained, setting them on the table. Said they'd be more useful in my hands. Isabella ran her fingers over the worn handles, tears prickling her eyes. Each tool was a symbol, not just of work, but of trust. Elena peeked in a box, her eyes wide. It's like treasure, Poppy. Daniel chuckled, ruffling her hair. Yes, Carino. The best kind of treasure, tools to build a better life. The community's generosity deepened one chilly evening in autumn. The Riveras had planned a family night in, but their apartment lost power due to an outage. They sat in the dim candlelight. Elena snuggled between them under a blanket. A knock came at the door. It was the single mom from upstairs, holding a thermos of hot cocoa. I figured you might need this, she said, smiling. Moments later, another knock, Mr. Nguyen from the 3rd floor, carrying a lantern. Use this until the power's back. Isabella's throat tightened as she looked around their darkened apartment, now glowing with unexpected light. She realized something profound. They weren't alone in this journey. Inspired, Isabella decided to give more intentionally. She organized a small meal swap among neighbors. Each family cooked one large dish and shared portions with 2 other families. The result was a variety of meals at a fraction of the cost, along with laughter and stories exchanged in the hallway. Daniel, too, began sharing his skills beyond paid jobs. He offered free Saturday workshops in the building's basement, teaching basic repairs, how to fix a leaky faucet, patch a hole, assemble furniture. The sessions drew not just men, but women and teens eager to learn. Knowledge is freedom, Daniel told them, handing out wrenches. The less you depend on paying someone else, the stronger you are. Isabella watched from the doorway, pride swelling as she saw her husband not just working, but leading. The community connection extended to Elena as well. She found herself surrounded by honorary aunts and uncles, grandparents and cousins. The older kids taught her games in the courtyard. Mrs. Lopez braided her hair. The Nguyen family shared stories from their homeland, filling her imagination with colorful tales. Elena thrived in the village that had formed around them, her laughter echoing through the hallways. One night, as Isabella tucked her in, Elena whispered, "I like our family, but I also like our big family here." Isabella kissed her forehead, her heart brimming. "Yes, Carino, we are blessed." The Riveras soon discovered that community didn't just offer help. It multiplied hope. One evening, Isabella and Daniel invited a handful of neighbors to their apartment for coffee. The conversation turned to money, to struggles, to dreams. "I wish I could save," one mother admitted, "but I don't even know where to start. Debt feels like drowning," another neighbor confessed. Isabella felt a spark. She pulled out her notebook, showing them the snowball method, the envelopes, the simple system that had transformed their lives. The neighbors leaned in, fascinated. "That's it. That's simple." "Yes," Isabella said softly. "It's not easy, but it works. One step at a time." From that night on, the Riveras weren't just debt fighters. They were guides. The apartment complex began to change in small, but powerful ways. Envelopes appeared in other kitchens. Meal swaps became regular events. Parents traded babysitting to save on childcare. People began sharing books on budgeting, tips for saving on groceries, and free resources. What had started as survival for the Riveras became transformation for many. Of course, not everyone understood. When Isabella told Marisol about the meal swaps, her sister laughed. "You're turning your building into some kind of commune." Isabella only smiled. "Call it what you want. But it's working." Marisol's laughter softened into curiosity. "Maybe I should come see." And when she did, witnessing neighbors trading meals, laughter ringing through the hallways, even Marisol admitted, "Okay, this is kind of amazing." By winter, the Riveras apartment no longer felt like an island. It felt like part of a woven fabric, threads connected in resilience. One snowy evening, Isabella stood at the window, watching as neighbors helped push a stranded car out of the lot. She turned to Daniel, her voice hushed. "This is wealth," she said. He nodded, pulling her close. "The kind no debt can touch." The debts were still there, balances still waiting, but they no longer felt like a crushing burden carried by two weary shoulders. They felt like a shared challenge, lightened by the strength of many hands. And as Isabella closed her notebook that night, she realized financial freedom wasn't just about numbers. It was about connection, generosity, and the unshakable truth that together, people could endure almost anything. The day began like any other. Gray skies over the city, the hum of traffic below, the smell of coffee filling the tiny apartment. Yet Isabella knew this day was different. She felt it in her chest, a hum of anticipation that beat with every heartbeat. At the kitchen table sat her notebook, open to the familiar page. But the number staring back at her was almost gone. Just one payment left. The student loan. The one she had carried since her early 20s, a shadow that had followed her from job to job, apartment to apartment, year after year. Today it would end. She called Daniel over, her hand trembling slightly as she held a pen. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Daniel sat beside her, his eyes serious but glowing. "More than ready." Isabella took a deep breath, logged into the account, and entered the final payment amount. Her finger hovered over the button. For a moment, she froze. Memories surged. The late nights crying over bills, the moments she feared she'd never escape, the hopelessness that once felt permanent. Then she pressed submit. The screen blinked, refreshed, and displayed the word she had dreamed of for years: balance. $0. The tears came instantly. Hot, uncontrollable, streaming down her cheeks as she covered her mouth with her hand. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if she might break. "It's gone," she whispered through sobs. "It's finally gone." Daniel kissed her hair, his own eyes glassy. "We did it. We really did it." Elena, perched at the table with her crayons, looked up in confusion. "Why are you crying, Mommy?" Isabella pulled her close, laughing through tears. "Because we're free, Carino. We're free." Elena tilted her head, puzzled but smiling, sensing the joy. "Free like the birds." Isabella kissed her forehead. "Exactly. Free like the birds." They sat in silence for a while, letting the moment sink into their bones. The apartment seemed lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from its walls. Finally, Daniel broke the quiet. "We need to celebrate." Isabella laughed softly. "With what money?" Daniel grinned. "Doesn't matter. We'll celebrate small. Because this is huge." That evening, they walked to the park, carrying a picnic basket filled with homemade sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade. It wasn't fancy, but it felt perfect. They spread a blanket under a tree, the summer air warm and golden. Elena ran across the grass, chasing butterflies, her laughter ringing like music. Isabella leaned against Daniel, her head on his shoulder. "Do you realize," she whispered, "that loan has been with me for almost 10 years. 10 years of payments. 10 years of guilt. And now," she trailed off, unable to finish. Daniel squeezed her hand. "Now it's done, and you'll never owe them another cent." Isabella closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. For the first time in a decade, her mind was quiet. Later, as they walked home, Isabella felt a strange mix of elation and disorientation. Freedom was sweet, but it was also unfamiliar. She had grown so used to carrying debt that living without it felt almost surreal. That night, she sat with her notebook, staring at the blank space where the loan balance had once been. Slowly, deliberately, she drew a bold line through the entry. The ink bled into the paper, final and irreversible. She sat back, tears filling her eyes again. "Goodbye," she whispered. In the days that followed, Isabella noticed subtle changes. She walked lighter. She laughed easier. Even food tasted better, as if colors had brightened, sounds had sharpened, life itself had opened. Yet with freedom came reflection. One evening, she sat on the balcony with Daniel, watching the sun sink behind the buildings. "Do you ever think about who we were before this journey?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Lost, stressed, always chasing, never catching up. And now," he smiled, his gaze steady, "now we're builders. Of freedom, of peace, of a future." Isabella leaned against him, her heart full. The milestone spread beyond their apartment. When Isabella told Mrs. Lopez about the loan, the older woman clasped her hands together, tears in her eyes. "You inspire us, Mija. You show us what's possible." At Daniel's Saturday workshop, when he mentioned the victory, the teenagers cheered. "Teach us how you did it, Mr. Rivera," one shouted. The celebration rippled through the building like a wave of hope. If the Riveras could slay such a giant, maybe others could too. Marisol, too, was moved. When Isabella told her the news, her sister's eyes widened. "Wait, you paid it off? All of it? All of it?" Isabella said proudly. Marisol shook her head in disbelief. "I thought you were crazy when you started this. But maybe you're onto something." Isabella smiled. "It's not about being crazy. It's about choosing differently." Marisol looked thoughtful, almost wistful. "Maybe I need to start choosing differently, too." The Riveras marked the victory in their own quiet way. They created a freedom jar, an old glass container Isabella decorated with scraps of paper. Inside, they placed slips with written goals, not just financial, but dreams, a family trip to the beach, starting a savings account for Elena, one day owning a small home. Each time they glanced at the jar, they were reminded that freedom wasn't the end. It was the beginning. One night, Isabella stood by the window, the city lights glittering below. She thought back to the girl she had been at 21, hopeful yet naive, signing loan papers with little understanding of the burden she was taking on. If she could speak to that girl now, she would say, "You will carry this weight, yes, but you will also overcome it. And when you do, You'll discover strength you never knew you had. The thought made her smile. She wasn't ashamed of the journey anymore. She was proud of it. Daniel joined her at the window, wrapping an arm around her waist. What are you thinking about? She turned to him, her eyes shining. I'm thinking about how freedom feels. He kissed her softly, whispering, get used to it. There's more coming. Together, they stood in the glow of the city, the first taste of freedom sweet on their tongues. And for the first time in years, Isabella felt not just hope, but certainty. They would finish this journey, and nothing could stop them now. The glow of victory lingered for weeks. Isabella floated through her days with a smile that wouldn't fade, savoring the quiet power of knowing she had slain her student loan. Daniel, too, carried himself taller, lighter. Even Elena sensed it, bursting with giggles whenever she overheard her parents whispering the word free. But life, as always, had its own timing. It began in the middle of a humid August evening. Daniel returned home from work with a stiffness in his step, his shirt clinging with sweat. Isabella greeted him with her usual kiss and a plate of beans and rice, but she noticed the way he rubbed his shoulder. You're hurting, she said, her brow furrowing. Daniel waved it off, wincing. Just a strain. Nothing I can't handle. But the pain didn't fade. Within days it worsened, spreading down his arm. At night, he shifted constantly in bed, groaning softly, his face etched with discomfort. Finally, Isabella insisted, we're going to the doctor. No arguments. The clinic visit confirmed what Isabella feared, a torn rotator cuff. Daniel would need weeks of rest, possibly surgery if it didn't heal properly. Isabella sat in the sterile room, her stomach sinking. Rest, she echoed. But his job? The doctor shook his head firmly. No heavy lifting. If he pushes through, he can make it worse. That means time off. Daniel exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He hated the thought of stopping, hated the thought of lost income. But Isabella squeezed his hand, her voice steady despite the panic in her chest. We'll get through it. The reality hit quickly. With Daniel's reduced hours, their income shrank almost overnight. The side hustle jobs he'd relied on, fixing furniture, patching walls, vanished entirely. Isabella stared at the budget one evening, the numbers blurring. She had grown used to momentum, to throwing hundreds of extra dollars at their debts. Now, not only was progress slowing, but survival was at stake. Daniel sat across from her, his arm in a sling, guilt heavy in his eyes. I hate this, he muttered. I feel useless. Isabella reached across the table, covering his hand. You're not useless. You're hurt. That's different. And this isn't forever. He nodded, but his expression remained clouded. To make ends meet, Isabella leaned harder into her own side hustle. She expanded her meal prep, cooking not just on Saturdays, but twice a week. Orders poured in as word spread, and soon her kitchen felt like a small factory, pots bubbling, trays stacked, Elena folding foil at the counter. But with growth came exhaustion. Isabella's back ached from hours on her feet. Her eyes stung from chopping onions. She found herself waking at dawn and collapsing past midnight, her body screaming for rest. One night, as she scrubbed trays in the sink, Daniel came up behind her. You're burning yourself out. She shook her head, her hands trembling in the soapy water. We don't have a choice. Daniel turned her gently, his eyes soft but firm. We always have a choice. We can slow down. Tears welled in her eyes. But if we slow down, we'll lose everything we worked for. No, he said, pulling her close. If we slow down, we'll still have each other. That's what matters. The following week, Isabella made a hard decision. She reduced her orders, cutting back to what she could manage without collapsing. The money shrank, but sanity returned. To compensate, the family tightened their budget even further. Entertainment dropped to zero. Grocery spending became surgical. Beans, rice, tortillas, bulk vegetables. Isabella clipped coupons with a fierceness she hadn't shown since the beginning of their journey. Elena noticed, too. One afternoon, she asked, Mommy, why don't we get ice cream anymore? Isabella knelt beside her, stroking her curls. Because we're saving, Carino. Sometimes we give things up so we can have something bigger later. Elena thought for a moment, then smiled. Like a surprise? Isabella hugged her tightly. Yes, my love. Like the biggest surprise. Despite the cuts, Despite the sacrifices, setbacks piled on. The car needed a new battery. Elena's school required a $40 fee for supplies. A winter storm drove their utility bill through the roof. Each expense felt like a blow, chipping away at their fragile balance. One night, after paying the bills, Isabella sat alone at the table, her head in her hands. "It feels like we're back where we started," she whispered into the silence. Daniel joined her, his sling gone now, but his shoulder still tender. He crouched beside her, lifting her chin gently. "No, Isa, we're not where we started. We've paid off debts. We've built habits. We've grown stronger. This is just a valley, not the beginning again." His words steadied her. She realized he was right. They hadn't lost everything. They were still climbing, even if the slope had steepened. In the midst of hardship, generosity returned to them. Mrs. Lopez dropped off a bag of produce, insisting, "Take it, Mija. My garden grows more than I can eat." The single mom upstairs offered free babysitting, so Isabella could rest. "You've cooked for me. Let me help you now." Even Marisol pitched in, surprising Isabella with a gift card for groceries. "Don't argue," she said firmly. "Sisters take care of each other." Each act of kindness reminded Isabella of a truth she had learned months before. Setbacks were easier when shared. Daniel's recovery was slow, but eventually his shoulder strengthened. By winter, he was back at work, cautious but grateful. The day he received his first full paycheck again, he came home with a grin, holding the envelope high. "We made it through," he said. Isabella hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. "We sacrificed. We stumbled, but we didn't fall." That night, as they sat with Elena between them, Isabella reflected on the months behind them. Setbacks had stripped them down to the essentials: family, resilience, trust. Sacrifices had hurt, but they had also clarified what mattered most. Debt freedom was still the goal, but love, endurance, and community had proven to be the foundation. And that, Isabella thought as she closed her notebook, was a foundation no storm could shake. Winter arrived with its hush of snow and silver mornings. The world outside their apartment slowed under blankets of white, but inside the Rivera household, life carried its steady rhythm of budgeting, cooking, and careful planning. Yet beneath the busyness, Isabella felt a stirring. Something quieter, something deeper. They had survived the storm of Daniel's injury. They had endured the sacrifices. The debt still lingered, yes, but for the first time, Isabella realized they had not just endured, they had grown. And in that realization, gratitude bloomed. It began with small moments. One morning, Isabella woke before dawn, the apartment dark and hushed. She padded to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the table with her notebook. Normally, the sight of balances and due dates filled her with a restless urgency. But that morning, she simply stared at the numbers and thought, "We are still here." She remembered the panic of months before, the fear that Daniel's lost income would sink them. But it hadn't. They had cut, scraped, hustled, leaned on community, and they had survived. A smile tugged at her lips. She whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." She wasn't sure to whom. To God, to fate, to resilience itself. But the gratitude felt real. Later that week, Isabella decided to start a new family ritual. At dinner, instead of diving straight into the meal, she asked, "What's one thing you're grateful for today?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, amused. "Homework questions at the table now." Isabella laughed. "No, corazon. Just try it." Elena perked up. "I'm grateful for cookies," she announced proudly. Daniel chuckled. "That's fair." He thought for a moment, then said, "I'm grateful my shoulder's healing. I didn't think I'd ever lift my arm again without pain." Isabella nodded, her chest warm. "And I'm grateful for both of you. For this meal. For this home." They bowed their heads for a moment of silence, and then the room filled with the clatter of forks and Elena's chatter. It was small, simple, but powerful. The practice continued. Some nights Elena said she was grateful for silly things: pigeons in the park, glitter glue, cartoons. Some nights Daniel spoke of work, of a coworker's kindness, of the strength returning to his arm. And Isabella found herself grateful for the very things she once resented: the tiny apartment, the cramped kitchen, the notebook filled with debts. Because each symbolized not just struggle, but survival. One particularly bitter night in January, The pipes in the building burst, leaving the hallways damp and noisy with repair crews. Neighbors grumbled, children fussed, tempers flared. But Isabella found herself oddly calm. She made hot cocoa, opened her door, and invited the kids from the hallway inside to play with Elena. Daniel helped carry buckets for the maintenance team. Later, when the water finally returned, a neighbor approached her. "I don't know how you stay so positive," she said, shaking her head. Isabella smiled softly. "Gratitude. It changes how you see things." Gratitude also began shaping their financial journey. One evening, Isabella explained it to Daniel as they sat together with a notebook. "You know, when I look at these debts now, I don't feel panic. I feel thankful." Daniel frowned. "Thankful? For debt?" She nodded. "Because each payment we make means we had the money to pay it. Each balance shrinking means we're capable. It's not a curse. It's proof of our growth." Daniel leaned back, considering her words. Slowly, his frown eased into a smile. "I like that. Turning chains into milestones." "Exactly," Isabella said, her eyes shining. Elena, too, absorbed the lessons in her own childlike way. One Saturday, while coloring at the table, she announced, "I'm going to make a gratitude book." She stapled pages together, scribbling drawings of her favorite things: her family, her dolls, the park, even beans and rice. Isabella flipped through the pages later, her heart swelling. "Do you know what this is, Carino?" she asked softly. "It's wealth, richer than anything money can buy." Elena beamed. "Then we're rich already." Isabella hugged her daughter tightly, tears stinging her eyes. Out of the mouths of children came the simplest truths. But gratitude didn't mean ignoring struggle. There were still days when Isabella felt weary, when bills pressed heavily, when sacrifices stung. But instead of spiraling into despair, she practiced gratitude like a muscle. When the grocery store total felt too high, she reminded herself, "At least we have food." When the apartment felt cramped, she whispered, "At least we have shelter." When progress felt slow, she told herself, "At least we're moving forward." It wasn't denial. It was perspective. Their neighbors noticed a shift. At the next meal swap, a young mother confessed, "I don't know how you stay hopeful with so much on your plate." Isabella smiled, handing her a tray of tamales. Because hope isn't about having less struggle. It's about seeing more blessings. The woman looked thoughtful, nodding slowly. Word spread, and soon others began adopting the practice. At the building's next community gathering, Daniel overheard someone say, "Tonight, I'm grateful for heat in this old building." Another chimed in, "I'm grateful for friends who share food." It was contagious. By spring, gratitude had become a way of life for the Riveras. One morning, Isabella woke to the sound of Elena giggling in her sleep. She lay there in the dawn light, listening to the gentle rhythm of Daniel's breathing beside her, and thought, "This is it. This is wealth. This is enough." She no longer measured success solely by the debts shrinking. She measured it by joy, by love, by laughter echoing through their small apartment. The debts would fall in time, but gratitude had already set them free. One evening, Isabella wrote a reflection in her notebook. Her pen moved slowly, deliberately, the words a testament to their journey. "We began this path chasing freedom. We thought it was only about money. But freedom is also in the heart. Gratitude makes us free now, even before the last debt is gone." She closed the notebook, her soul quiet, her spirit light. When she shared the reflection with Daniel, he kissed her forehead. "You're right. Gratitude is the freedom we already own." And in that moment, Isabella realized something profound. Money could vanish, jobs could falter, life could unravel. But gratitude was untouchable. And as long as they held on to it, they would never truly be poor again. Spring arrived with its chorus of birdsong and the scent of blossoms drifting in from the city parks. Windows were cracked open, children played in the courtyard again, and the Riveras felt a shift not just in the weather, but in their spirits. Debt no longer felt like an endless mountain. Gratitude had softened the climb, and victories along the way had built their strength. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the apartment in amber light, Isabella looked across the table at Daniel and said something that startled even herself. "What comes after this?" Daniel paused mid-bite, his fork hovering. After what? After the debt, Isabella said. Her voice was steady, thoughtful. What happens when it's all gone? What's next for us? Daniel leaned back, considering. For months, no, for years, their lives had revolved around survival and sacrifice. The idea of a next beyond that felt foreign. But the more he thought, the more he realized how much he longed to answer. I guess, he said slowly, we start dreaming again. That night, they pulled out the notebook, not for balances, not for budgets, but for visions. Isabella drew a line down the page, writing at the top, our future. Okay, she said, tapping her pen. What do we want? Not just need. Want. Daniel chuckled nervously. Feels dangerous to even ask that. Maybe, Isabella admitted. But we've earned the right to dream. They began hesitantly, as though testing the waters of imagination. A house, Daniel said first. Something small, with a yard for Elena. Isabella nodded, her heart swelling. Yes, and maybe a little garden. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs. She wrote the words carefully, each one a seed planted in possibility. Then came more dreams. Daniel wanted to return to school for certification in carpentry. Not just odd jobs, he explained. I want to build something lasting. Maybe even start my own business. Isabella's eyes shone. You'd be amazing at that. And Isabella? She dreamed of writing. A cookbook filled with stories of her family recipes, of resilience told through food. Our meals have carried us, she said softly. I want to share that. Daniel reached across the table, squeezing her hand. Then you should. Elena, too, added her visions when they asked her. I want a puppy, she declared proudly, and a pink bike, and to go to the beach. Daniel laughed, scribbling her list on the page. A puppy, a bike, and the ocean. Noted. Elena grinned, satisfied, as though her dreams carried just as much weight as theirs. Over the weeks that followed, future talks became a regular ritual. On evenings when the debt felt heavy, they'd return to the notebook and flip to the dream page. It reminded them that their journey wasn't just about eliminating numbers. It was about building something new. One Saturday, Isabella took the notebook to the park. Sitting under a budding tree, she read the list aloud. A home, education, a business, a cookbook, a puppy, a beach trip. Each dream felt impossible once. But now they felt like steps waiting to be climbed. The act of dreaming began shaping their daily choices. When Isabella was tempted to splurge on new shoes, she thought of the house fund instead. When Daniel considered picking up an exhausting side job, he asked himself if it aligned with his vision of carpentry long-term. Even Elena, in her childlike way, began putting coins in a jar labeled puppy money. Dreams gave sacrifice a new flavor, less like deprivation, more like investment. One evening, as they walked home from the park, Isabella turned to Daniel with a thoughtful expression. Do you ever feel like we were blind before? He frowned. Blind how? Blind to what was possible, she said. We thought debt was forever. We thought small. But now, she gestured to the sky, the city lights twinkling. Now I see how much more there could be. Daniel nodded slowly. Debt kept us looking down. Dreams make us look up. The words settled between them, heavy with truth. Isabella decided to create a vision board for their family. She gathered old magazines, scissors, glue, and a poster board. One Sunday afternoon, she spread everything on the floor. Okay, she announced. Let's picture our future. Together, they cut out images, houses with gardens, carpentry tools, beaches, puppies, books. Elena glued glittery stars in the corners. Daniel laughed as he pasted a photo of a workbench. Isabella carefully placed an image of a family cooking together. When they finished, they stepped back and stared at the collage. It wasn't just paper and pictures. It was hope made visible. Isabella hung it on the wall above their table. So we never forget what we're working toward. As weeks passed, the board became a compass. On hard days, Isabella would glance at the picture of a sunny beach and remind herself why she cooked another tray of enchiladas. Daniel would look at the carpentry tools and imagine himself building something lasting. Elena would point at the puppy picture and giggle. One day, dreams turned discipline into devotion. But not everyone understood. When Isabella shared the vision board with Marisol, her sister smirked. Cute, but don't you think it's a little unrealistic? You barely make it by now. Isabella didn't flinch. Maybe, But we once thought paying off debt was unrealistic too. And look at us now. Marisol rolled her eyes but softened. Well, I guess you're proving me wrong. Isabella smiled gently. Dreams don't have to be realistic right away. They just have to be worth moving toward. The Rivera's vision soon inspired others in their community. At Daniel's Saturday workshop, a neighbor asked, "Why do you keep working so hard, even after setbacks?" Daniel pointed to the board he carried in his notebook, a miniature version Isabella had made. "Because we have a future we're building toward. Not just paying off, but building." The neighbor stared, intrigued. "Maybe I need a vision board too." Daniel grinned. "Start with one dream. The rest will follow." By early summer, the family decided to take their first small step toward the vision, saving for Elena's beach trip. They set aside just $10 a week in a jar. It was slow, almost laughably so, but it was something. Elena checked the jar often, her excitement infectious. "How many more weeks, Mommy?" she asked eagerly. "Many," Isabella admitted, smiling. "But we'll get there." And for the first time, saving didn't feel like a chore. It felt like anticipation. One evening, Isabella and Daniel sat on the balcony, watching the city lights. Isabella leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you realize? Our dreams aren't just ours. They're Elena's inheritance." Daniel nodded, his voice hushed. "We're showing her what's possible." Isabella smiled, her heart swelling. And that might be the greatest gift of all. For years, debt had defined their world. Now, dreams were redefining it. And though the road ahead was still long, Isabella felt certain of one thing. The vision for their future was no longer just a wish. It was a plan. The notebook lay open on the kitchen table one quiet evening, but Isabella wasn't staring at the numbers this time. Instead, her eyes wandered to the margins where Elena had doodled little hearts and stars in crayon. For a long moment, Isabella simply traced the edges of those doodles with her fingertip, her mind wandering back, far back, to the little girl she once was. That little girl had grown up in a cramped apartment too. But in her world, bills were whispered about with shame. Lights were cut off more than once. Groceries were stretched so thin that dinners often consisted of rice and butter, or beans without seasoning. Money was always a shadow in her childhood, never discussed openly, but always present, shaping choices, fueling arguments, stealing peace. And as Isabella looked at Elena's bright, happy scribbles, she felt a fierce determination rise in her chest. She will not inherit that shadow, Isabella thought. This cycle ends with me. The realization hit her fully one afternoon when she visited her parents. Her mother, Rosa, greeted her with the same tired smile Isabella remembered from childhood. The apartment looked almost unchanged. Framed photos on the wall, worn furniture, a stack of bills on the counter. As they sipped tea together, Rosa sighed. "Mija, money just doesn't stretch anymore. I don't know how we'll cover everything this month." Isabella's chest tightened. The words were echoes of her childhood, phrases she had heard so often they were etched into her bones. But instead of sinking into despair, Isabella felt something different this time. Clarity. She reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. "Mama, we've been learning. Budgeting. Paying things down. There are ways. We don't have to stay stuck." Rosa gave her a weary smile. "You've always been the dreamer." "Not just a dreamer," Isabella said firmly. "A doer." On the bus ride home, Isabella couldn't shake the conversation. It wasn't just about her mother. It was about generations. Her grandmother had worked herself raw, cleaning houses to keep food on the table. Her mother had juggled jobs, debts, and exhaustion. And Isabella realized she was the first to confront the pattern head-on. Debt, scarcity, silence. She was rewriting the story. That night, she shared her thoughts with Daniel. "You know," she said softly, "it's not just about us. It's about Elena, about her children someday, about teaching her that money doesn't have to be fear, it can be a tool." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "You're right. We're not just paying bills. We're breaking chains." The phrase lingered in the air like a vow. Breaking chains. The next weekend, Isabella decided to begin teaching Elena small money lessons. At the store, when Elena begged for a toy, Isabella knelt down and explained, "We have a budget, Carino. That means we decide together how to use our money. Do we want this toy? Or do we want to keep saving for the beach trip?" Elena thought hard, her little brow furrowed. Finally, she said, the beach. Because we can all go together. Isabella hugged her daughter tightly, tears pricking her eyes. Even at 6, Elena was learning lessons Isabella hadn't known until adulthood. Daniel began teaching Elena too. One Saturday, he handed her 3 envelopes labeled Give, Save, Spend. He placed a few coins in her palm and showed her how to divide them. Some is for helping others, some is for your dreams, and some is for fun, he explained. Elena giggled, tucking her coins into the envelopes. I'm saving for a puppy, she declared proudly. Isabella watched with pride, realizing that what had once been a generational silence was now an open, joyful conversation. Money was no longer taboo. It was a language of empowerment. The change wasn't just for Elena. At the next family gathering, Isabella found herself sharing budgeting tips with her cousins. Around the kitchen table, she explained the envelope system, the snowball method, the small habits that had transformed their lives. One cousin shook her head in amazement. I never thought about it like that. No one in our family ever talked about money. We just survived. Isabella smiled gently. That's why we need to start now. So the next generation doesn't just survive, they thrive. The word sparked something in the room. For the first time, Isabella felt like she wasn't just managing her own life. She was influencing her family's legacy. But breaking cycles wasn't easy. Old habits lingered. One evening, Marisol confessed, I maxed out my credit card again. I couldn't say no when the kids wanted new shoes. Isabella listened without judgment. I get it. I've been there. But what if we planned differently next time? What if you had a sinking fund just for shoes? Marisol sighed. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, Isabella admitted. But it's possible. Slowly, gently, she began guiding her sister the way she had guided herself. The impact showed most clearly in Elena. One afternoon, Isabella overheard her daughter playing with dolls. The dolls were going shopping, but before they bought anything, Elena had them pull tiny scraps of paper from envelopes she had made. This is the budget, Elena said in her serious play voice. We can't spend it all in one place. Isabella laughed softly from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride. Elena was absorbing lessons that would change her life. Lessons Isabella had never been taught at that age. The cycle was breaking, right there on the living room floor with a handful of dolls and paper envelopes. One night, Isabella sat with Daniel on the balcony, the city alive with distant hums and lights. Do you realize, she whispered, we are the hinge? Everything before us was one way. Everything after us will be another. Daniel nodded, wrapping an arm around her. It's a heavy responsibility, but it's also the greatest gift. Isabella rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes glistening. Our daughter will grow up with tools we never had, and that changes everything. Her reflections deepened one Sunday when she lit a candle in church. As the flame flickered, she prayed quietly. Let Elena never feel the fear I felt. Let her know abundance, wisdom, freedom. Let the chain stop here. She walked out lighter, as though the prayer had anchored itself into her bones. Breaking cycles, Isabella realized, wasn't about perfection. She and Daniel still stumbled, still made mistakes. But every choice to budget, every lesson taught, every open conversation was a brick laid in a new foundation. A foundation of honesty, of resilience, of hope. And as she tucked Elena in that night, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, Isabella whispered a promise into the dark. You will never carry the chains I carried. You will inherit freedom. The vision board hung above the kitchen table like a compass, reminding the Riveras of where they were headed. The house, the garden, the puppy, the beach trip, the life they were building beyond debt. Gratitude had carried them through storms, and breaking cycles had given their journey new meaning. But now, the numbers in Isabella's notebook told a story of a different kind. The end was near. Only $5,200 remained. After years of sacrifices, side hustles, tears, and triumphs, the mountain that once felt endless had shrunk into a hill. Still steep, still exhausting, but within reach. Isabella stared at the number 1 evening, her pen tapping the page. We're so close, she whispered. So close I can taste it. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing with determination. Then let's finish it. Let's give it everything we've got. And with that, the Riveras entered what Isabella would later call the final push. The final push was different than the beginning. In the early days, the challenge had been building momentum, fighting hopelessness, learning new habits. Now, the challenge was endurance. It felt like the last miles of a marathon, the body screaming for rest, but the finish line pulling the runner forward. Every decision carried weight. Every dollar was scrutinized. Every opportunity was seized. Isabella cut their grocery bill again, relying on bulk beans, rice, and lentils, rotating recipes to keep Elena excited about meals. Daniel picked up weekend hours at the workshop, his shoulder finally strong enough to handle the labor. They sold items they had once thought they'd never part with: a guitar, a set of dishes, even Isabella's wedding dress, carefully preserved but no longer practical. "The memories aren't in the dress," she told Daniel gently as they folded it into a box. "They're in us." Each sacrifice brought them closer. One evening, Isabella sat with Elena to explain. "Do you know what happens when we finish paying everything?" Elena tilted her head, curious. "It means we won't owe anyone anymore. It means more of our money could go to things we love, like our beach trip, and it means we'll be free." Elena's eyes widened. "Free like the birds again?" Isabella smiled, kissing her forehead. "Yes, Carino. Free like the birds." Elena nodded solemnly, as though she understood the weight of the moment. "Then let's do it fast." Her words became a rallying cry. The apartment transformed into a war room of discipline. A new jar labeled "Last Debt" sat on the counter, swallowing every spare dollar. Daniel took on odd repair jobs for neighbors, refusing payment at times in cash, but accepting groceries or small contributions toward the jar. Isabella worked extra hours in the kitchen, selling trays of enchiladas and tamales to offices and schools. Even Elena contributed. She decided to pause her puppy fund, transferring her coins into the "Last Debt" jar instead. "We can get the puppy after," she said with a grin. Isabella hugged her tightly, tears in her eyes. "You're helping break the chains, mi amor." But the final push wasn't without its tests. One month, their fridge broke down. The repairman's fee devoured nearly $200 of their savings. Isabella wept in frustration, slamming her hand against the counter. "It feels like the universe doesn't want us to finish," she sobbed. Daniel pulled her close, his voice steady. "No, this is just the universe asking, how bad do you want it? And our answer is, bad enough." They pressed on. Another challenge came when Marisol invited them on a weekend getaway. "It's cheap," she insisted. "You deserve a break." For a moment, Isabella was tempted. She longed for escape, for indulgence. But then she glanced at the vision board. "We can't," she said firmly, though her voice cracked. "Not yet." Marisol rolled her eyes. "You're too strict. Life is short." Isabella nodded. "Life is short. That's why I want to live it free, not chained." By summer, the debt had dropped below $2,000. The number stunned Isabella. She remembered when it had been $20,000, when it had seemed unmovable, when she had cried over the impossibility of it all. And now here it was, just a fraction of what it once was. She stood before the notebook one evening, tracing the numbers with trembling fingers. "This is real," she whispered. "We're really doing it." Daniel hugged her from behind, his voice warm in her ear. "We're not just doing it. We're almost done." Momentum surged. Every week, Isabella found herself flipping eagerly to the debt page, watching the balance shrink. $1,750. Then $1,200. Then $900. Each payment felt like swinging a hammer against a wall that had loomed over them for years. Even Elena began cheering. Whenever Isabella updated the notebook, Elena clapped and shouted, "Another brick down." The phrase stuck. Paying debt became demolition, and their tiny apartment buzzed with the energy of walls crumbling around them. Yet as the numbers shrank, Isabella noticed something unexpected: fear. One night, she confessed it to Daniel. What if freedom feels empty? We've spent so long fighting debt. Who are we without it? Daniel took her hand gently. "We're builders, ISA. Debt has been the demolition. But after this, we start construction. Of dreams. Of legacy. Of everything we've wanted." She nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. Finally, the balance reached $250. The last payment loomed. Isabella stared at the number one morning, her heart pounding. 10 years of chains, of struggle, of tears, about to end with a single keystroke. But she hesitated. She wanted to savor it, to make the moment sacred. So she and Daniel decided to wait until Friday evening. They would make the last payment together, as a family, with Elena at their side. That Friday, they gathered around a laptop at the kitchen table. Isabella's hands trembled as she typed in the amount. Elena climbed on her lap, wide-eyed. Daniel placed his hand over Isabella's, steadying her. "Ready?" he whispered. Isabella nodded, tears already burning her eyes. Together, they clicked submit. The screen blinked. The words appeared. Balance, $0. For a moment, silence. Then Elena clapped wildly, shouting, "We did it. We're free." Isabella covered her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel wrapped his arms around both of them, his face buried in Isabella's hair. "It's over," he whispered. "It's really over." The apartment seemed to exhale with them, as if its walls had been waiting for this moment too. They didn't celebrate with champagne or parties. Instead, they pulled out the vision board and stared at it together. "The debts are gone," Isabella whispered. "Now we build." Daniel kissed her forehead. "Now we build." And Elena, her eyes sparkling, pointed at the picture of the puppy. "Now we get this." They all burst into laughter, the sound ringing with joy, relief, and the promise of new beginnings. The final push was complete. The chains were broken, and for the first time, the Riveras stood not just debt-free, but future-ready. The apartment felt different after the debt was gone. The walls hadn't changed, nor the furniture, nor the hum of the old fridge in the corner. But something intangible had shifted, an invisible weight had lifted. The Riveras no longer moved through their days with the quiet dread of bills hanging overhead. The notebook, once filled with balances and due dates, now sat closed on the shelf, no longer a symbol of chains, but of victory. For the first time in years, Isabella felt as though her lungs could expand fully. "This is what freedom feels like," she whispered one morning as she opened the window, letting the sunlight pour in. Yet freedom didn't mean the end of discipline. Quite the opposite. It meant the beginning of a new kind of intentionality. Isabella sat at the table with a fresh notebook, its pages blank and inviting. She wrote at the top of the first page, the Rivera future plan. The entries that followed were different from the old ones. No minimum payments, no creditor names, no snowball charts. Instead, emergency fund, $1,000, start this month. Beach trip savings jar, continue weekly. House down payment fund, long-term. Daniel's carpentry certification fund. Cookbook project, outline plus recipes. When Daniel came home from work, she showed him the list. He leaned over her shoulder, reading slowly, then let out a low whistle. "Looks a lot better than the old notebook," he said with a grin. Isabella laughed, her heart swelling. It's not survival anymore. It's growth. The first priority was building an emergency fund. They agreed. No more surprises knocking them off course. So every side hustle dollar, every extra sale, every leftover coin from the grocery envelope went into a glass jar marked peace of mind. It wasn't glamorous. Watching the jar grow from nothing to a few $100s felt slow. But Isabella found joy in it anyway. One evening, Elena dropped her allowance coins into the jar with a flourish. "For our safety net," she announced, echoing her mother's words. Daniel chuckled. 6 years old and already talking like a financial planner. Isabella ruffled her daughter's hair, her heart brimming with pride. The lessons were sinking in. By midsummer, they had saved their first $1,000. Isabella took a photo of the jar before depositing it into the bank. "Proof," she told Daniel, "that we're building, not just surviving." Daniel kissed her cheek. Proof that the chains really are gone. Next came the beach trip. For months, Elena had been dropping coins into the jar, her excitement growing. When they finally counted it all, over $300 saved, Elena squealed with delight. "We're going to the ocean," she shouted, spinning in circles. The trip wasn't extravagant. They drove to the nearest coast, packed sandwiches and snacks, and rented a small cabin near the water. But for the Riveras, it felt like luxury. On their first morning, Isabella stood barefoot on the sand, watching Elena chase waves while Daniel built a sandcastle beside her. Her chest swelled with emotion. "This is why we fought so hard. For moments like this, for memories like these. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, painting the sky in gold and crimson, Isabella whispered, "We are free. And this is just the beginning." Back home, Daniel enrolled in night classes for carpentry certification. The tuition wasn't cheap, but this time they paid in cash, refusing to borrow. Each evening, Daniel returned home exhausted, but glowing with purpose. "I'm learning so much," he told Isabella one night, flipping through his textbooks. "And for the first time, I feel like I'm not just working jobs. I'm building a career." Isabella hugged him tightly. "You deserve this. You've always had the skill. Now you'll have the paper to prove it." The classes meant late nights and long weekends, but Isabella supported him wholeheartedly, cooking extra trays of food to sell and picking up the slack at home. She knew this wasn't just for him. It was for all of them, for the life they were shaping. Meanwhile, Isabella began drafting her cookbook. She started small, writing down recipes she had perfected during their frugal years. Beans with garlic and cumin, lentil stew, enchiladas made with pantry staples. But alongside each recipe, she wrote a short story. Stories of resilience, of community, of meals that had carried them through the hardest times. "Food is more than survival," she wrote. "It's memory, culture, love, and resilience on a plate." Daniel read her drafts late at night, his eyes shining. "This isn't just a cookbook," he said. "It's our story. It's a gift to anyone walking the same road." Isabella blushed, her heart fluttering. "Do you think people would read it?" "People need it," Daniel said firmly. "They need to know they're not alone." As months turned into a year, the Rivera's life blossomed in ways they had once thought impossible. The emergency fund grew. Daniel completed his certification, landing more steady work. Isabella's recipes gained attention. Neighbors began asking for copies, and even a local community center invited her to host a cooking workshop. And through it all, Elena thrived. She rode her pink bike through the courtyard, saved coins diligently, and spoke with pride about her family's journey. "My parents paid off a lot of money," she told a teacher one day. "Now we're saving for a house and a puppy." The teacher smiled, later telling Isabella, "She's so proud of you. You're her heroes." Isabella's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. Heroes. Once, she had felt like a failure. Now, her daughter saw her as a symbol of strength. With debt behind them, the Riveras also gave back more intentionally. They continued the meal swaps, but now they also set aside money in their give envelope to help neighbors in need. When Mrs. Lopez's heater broke one winter, Daniel fixed it for free. When the single mom upstairs struggled with groceries, Isabella delivered a meal without hesitation. Generosity, Isabella realized, wasn't about abundance. It was about heart, and the more they gave, the richer they felt. One crisp autumn evening, Isabella and Daniel sat on the balcony, sipping tea as Elena slept inside. "Do you realize," Isabella said softly, "we've lived in this apartment for almost a decade? At first, it felt like a prison. Now, it feels like the soil where we grew roots." Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting the city lights. "It's our foundation, but I think it's time to start dreaming about the next place." Isabella smiled, her heart racing with excitement. "The house." "Yes," Daniel said firmly. "The house." They didn't know how long it would take, or what obstacles might arise. But for the first time, the dream didn't feel impossible. It felt inevitable. Isabella closed her eyes, imagining it. A small home with a garden, sunlight streaming into a kitchen where she would cook not out of scarcity, but out of joy. A backyard where Elena would run with the puppy they had promised her. A space filled not with fear of bills, but with laughter, gratitude, and love. She opened her eyes, meeting Daniel's gaze. "We'll get there." He squeezed her hand. Together, the Rivera's journey had begun in debt, despair, and sacrifice. But it ended here, in freedom, vision, and legacy. They weren't wealthy by the world's standards. They didn't own a big house or drive fancy cars. But they had something richer, wisdom earned through struggle, gratitude etched into their bones, and a future unchained. And as Isabella tucked Elena into bed that night, whispering their nightly gratitude, she realized this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one built not on fear, but on hope. And hope, she knew, was the greatest wealth of all.